Chapter 11:18. This river had many names. It was called the Wei River in the 20 miles around the Tang border. It was called the Yi River in the Yan Kingdom, also known as the Juma River. In the Song Kingdom, it was called the Tongtian River, because one of its tributaries flowed directly into the Storm Sea. The Song Kingdom always insisted that it was the main river, and completely ignored the fact that it was still more than 700 miles away from the Great Swamp. No one called it the Great River, because there was already a great river in the south of the human world. But this river was actually very large with abundant water and wide waves. The wind blew through the paddy fields, and the flowers bloomed on both sides. It had nurtured countless people, especially in the area before and after the Yan border. The river was extremely wide. No matter how good one's eyesight was, it was difficult to see the face of the person on the other side of the river, and naturally could not recognize who it was. But Ning Ke looked at the other side of the river, and recognized that it was Long Qing. It was an indescribable feeling, as natural as the great river flowing into the sea. Or perhaps it should be said that it was only natural. The world was so big, and the Yi River was so cold. There were frequent wars and fires of war. Those who should have escaped had long escaped and walked in the wilderness. But someone appeared on the other side of the river. Of course, that person could only be Long Qing. The big black horse stopped and Ning Ke looked at the other side. At the same time, Long Qing also stopped and looked at him. Their eyes met on the surging river. He did not say, "So you are also here," but simply said, "I see you, so you can't leave." After a moment of silence, Ning Ke pulled the reins lightly and continued to gallop north. Long Qing also galloped north on the other side of the river. His horse was obviously extraordinary, as it could keep up with the big black horse. Ning Ke was a little hungry and stopped at a bend in the winter sky. He took out some dry food and began to eat with the river water. Long Qing also stopped and took a few sips from his wine bag to quench his thirst. Ning Ke stopped and picked up some branches to make a bonfire. He allowed the big black horse to wander around and rest while he sat by the fire to roast the wild wheat. He roasted it until it was slightly burnt and fragrant. Then he threw it into his mouth and began chewing. Not long after, a bonfire was also lit on the other side of the river, which was particularly eye-catching in the early night. Ning Ke woke up when the morning sun shone on the earth. He walked to the shore and scooped up a handful of chilly river water. He washed his face and looked up, only to see Long Qing drawing water with a leather bag. He did not even look at him. Ning Ke continued north while Long Qing continued to follow him on the other side. The two of them did not speak, maintaining absolute silence. There was no threatening look in their eyes, not even a hint of hostility. Naturally, there were no flying swords, arrows, peach blossoms, or divine talismans. Deep in the Yan territory, the river turned west and entered a valley that was not high. The river was much narrower than yesterday, and the people on the other side could see it more clearly. Ning Ke and Long Qing and Ning Ke were still as they were. Whether it was the left bank or the right bank, the banks of the river always looked the same. There would be water plants, sand, stone steps in populated areas, blue stones used to wash clothes, waste thrown into the river by people on boats, rotten vegetable leaves floating on the surface of the water, and winding lines. But the two sides of the river were always parallel to each other. They would only meet each other if they went back to the source, or entered the Great Swamp or the sea. Enemies were often the most similar to each other. They had been competing with each other for many years, and seemed to know each other very well. But in fact, they had never really touched each other. They just looked at each other. The higher they went upstream, the colder the wind became, and the narrower the Yi River became. Ning Ke could already see Long Qing's eyebrows and eyes very clearly. He could see the scar that had faded a lot. Long Qing could also see the few very inconspicuous freckles on his cheeks, and the straw rope wrapped around the hilt of the iron cutlass on his shoulder. 2 days after entering the North Yan mountain range, they reached the end of the mountains and the end of the river. There was endless fog, like white clouds rising from the ground. It was as beautiful as a fairyland, and covered both of them. There was an angry sound of water coming from the clouds, crashing into the cliff and shattering into countless pieces. One could imagine how steep the invisible river became in the valley. Ning Ke got off the horse and looked at the other side of the fog. He did not know if Long Qing was there. At this moment, Long Qing's voice came from the fog. What did you write? Ning Ke and Long Qing were considered by many to be lifelong enemies. In fact, their fates had always been intertwined over the years. The two of them rarely met, but every time they did, it would be a matter of life and death. Every time they met, the outcome would affect them, and even the broader fates and futures. They met by the Yi River, and walked silently on both sides of the river. They did not say a word, but only compared each other by the bonfire. They did not start to talk until they reached the end of the mountains, and could not see each other. However, Ning Ke did not expect that the first thing Long Qing said would be this. It made his pupil shrink. What did Ning Ke write with the blood of the barbarians on the grassland outside the city of Wei? He went to the Lang temple, and saw the stone broken into 3 halves in the autumn rain. Did he write? If he did, what did he write? Was it the last volume of the Doctrine of the New Stream that was handed to Chen Pipi? Or what? Everyone is in the West Hill. Why did you come here? Ning Ke did not answer Long Qing's question. Although Long Qing's first words had exposed his thoughts, he felt that the proverb did make sense. The person who knew you best was often your enemy. Long Qing's voice came from the fog again. Because you are here. Ning Ke's expression did not change. He untied the iron bow on his shoulder, and seemed to want to rest here for a while. Long Qing's meaning was very clear. For Taoism or the human world, the final battle in the West Hill Divine Palace was important. But it was not as important as Ning Ke's whereabouts. Many people are guessing when I will go to Capital Chung to kill you. But I don't think so. Other than the fact that I don't like being watched, the more important reason is that I am not sure that I can kill you. I know you will not go to Capital Chung to find me, so I have been waiting for you at the border. There are countless idiots in the world who always think that there will be a battle between you and me. Have you become so stupid that you have to act according to the plot in the story? I have said that I am not sure that I can kill you. Besides, I have killed a Da and Hungmu. It is boring and monotonous to kill them in order. It is not in line with the aesthetic of the academy. Ning Ke calmly looked at the iron bow on his knees. He did not know when, but a dark iron arrow from the quiver was already in his hand. The whole process of taking out the arrow did not make any sound. He was telling the truth. Long Qing was indeed very powerful now. How could a person who even eldest brother could not see through not be powerful? More importantly, the Abbey Dean had given Long Qing the most important mission of killing Yi Su to help him become a sage. It was not easy to kill such a person, so why would he take the risk to kill him? However, Ning Ke knew that he was also very powerful. According to the proverb, Long Qing should know that he was powerful and not easy to kill. He did not want to fight with Long Qing, so why did Long Qing stop him? You killed people all over the world because you were looking for someone. Others might not understand, but I do. You killed Hungmu and Ada just to find her. You always thought that since they said it themselves and the whole human world was talking about them, that they were her gifts or children in the human world. Then you could get some information by killing them. Deep in the clouds, Long Qing's voice sounded again after a moment of silence. I am different. I am not a gift left by Haoyan to the human world. From that moment on, I am not qualified to be her son. Of course, I am not interested in such a title now. I am nothing. I have betrayed her. I only believe in myself. Under such circumstances, it is meaningless for you to kill me. Why take the risk? Ning Ke's fingers gently stroked the bowstring that was as hard as stone and as stable as a mountain. He said, Yes. Long Qing said, You will not come to kill me, but I will come to you, because I feel that you are getting closer to finding her. I have different thoughts from the headmaster. I think you are the most likely to find her. I cannot let you continue. I don't care what you are going to write in the end. I cannot let you write anymore. Ning Ke raised his head and looked deep into the clouds. He said, You think highly of me. Long Qing's voice came. Those who look down on you are all dead. Ning Ke was silent for a moment and said, I used to look down on you when you wanted to be her maidservant. Long Qing said, Yes. Looking back at that time and thinking about her identity, I am so stupid and arrogant. Ning Ke said, You used the word idiot first. You are so strong that I have nothing to say. Long Qing said, Thank you. Ning Ke continued, Later on, I shot you on the snow cliff, but you survived. You survived shamelessly. You made me vigilant because I also survived like that. In fact, you almost killed me in the autumn rain at the Red Lotus Temple. Long Qing's voice sounded a bit regretful. But I still couldn't kill you. Ning Ke said, Now that I think about it, it is all God's will. Long Qing agreed. Haotian was always by your side. God's will belongs to you. Ning Ke said, If I were you, I would not be convinced either. Long Qing said, Nothing. Ning Ke said, Otherwise, why are you here now? He had asked this question before and Long Qing had already answered it. In order to prevent him from finding Sang Sang. In order to prevent him from writing that word. For Taoism or the human world. For many glorious, great. And just things. But he repeated his question. Long Qing was silent for a long time. And then gave a new answer. Yes, this is an unnecessary battle. Haotian Taoism. The human world. And the word you wrote are all excuses. I just want to see if I can kill you now, because I am not convinced. In the clouds, his voice was very calm, as if he was a naughty child who had torn off his clothes and played in the mud by the river naked. It was so real that it made people sigh with emotion. It was silent, except for the sound of the water. Ning Ke stood up and looked at the source of the voice in the clouds. He did not speak for a long time. Long Qing also did not speak for a long time. The world was very big. They did not meet many times, but every time they met was unforgettable. Ning Ke won 3 times in a row. Ning Ke won 3 times in a row. Because of the iron arrow, Long Qing became a disabled person. He abandoned his fiancée and became a devil in the darkness. He learned the gray eyes skill and betrayed Taoism. He thought he had mastered it and ambushed Ning Ke in front of the Red Lotus Temple. He did not expect Ning Ke to learn the practice of Tao Tai. Even if they were like 2 wild dogs biting each other, Ning Ke still won. There were many stories after that, generous, bitter, glorious, and heavy. They walked separately on both sides of the river according to their different fates, survived with difficulty, and continued to shine. They really met at the end of the mountain and sat down to discuss Taoism. It was not about the Taoism of life and death, but only one word. He was not convinced. Since there was Ning Ke in the world, why was there still a need for him? Long Qing was not convinced. This story had gone on for too long, and it was time to end it. It did not matter whether there was a reason or not. Ning Ke quietly looked at the depths of the clouds and felt the willpower, feeling very emotional. He had felt that willpower in many places. For example, the bottom of the Daming Lake, and the cliff cave in the back of the mountain of the academy. He did not expect that Long Qing's unwillingness was so strong. He respected him very much. He raised the iron bow, aimed at the position confirmed by the conversation, and pulled the string without hesitation. With a buzz, the iron arrow left the string and disappeared instantly. His expression was still as calm as before, calm and cold-blooded. He said some words, recalled some of the past, and felt some respect and emotion. But I still want to kill you. Since you have been unconvinced for so long, then please continue to be unconvinced until the netherworld. It's not like the occasional cold my wife mentioned yesterday. Although it's an occasional cold, the cold is extremely severe. It's a good thing that I've spent the entire day writing this plot. Naturally, there will be some readers who won't be very happy about it, but I really can't write anymore. The main reason is because this plot itself, in my opinion, is complete. More importantly, after writing the plot, I have a serious sense of mission completion. I feel like tomorrow will be a new day, blah 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 blah. I love you all. Chapter 11:19. The clouds were thick and the fog was thick. Only the sound could be heard, but no one could be seen. It was a good time to have a heart-to-heart talk, to review their lives, and to sigh with emotion. Even if they didn't want to forget the enmity, they should at least appreciate each other. Then they would straighten their clothes, point their swords at each other, and finish a lifetime of fighting as equals. Who would have thought that Ning Ke would suddenly attack with his strongest iron arrow? At such a beautiful moment, he used the most shameless sneak attack. If there was an audience, they would definitely be amazed by his shamelessness. A soft buzzing sound came from the steady string of the iron bow. The iron arrow pierced through the air and disappeared in the blink of an eye. The river hidden in the clouds splashed, and a clear and terrifying arrow hole appeared in the clouds. The opposite bank was in front of the arrow hole. There was no one and no sound. The iron arrow directly swept over the shallow hills on the opposite bank, flew to a faraway place, or fell into the storm sea. Ning Kei's calm and even cold-blooded sneak attack did not gain anything, because his enemy today was the one who knew him best. He knew his shamelessness and coldness, and would not give him such a chance. But there were still some things that he didn't understand. Long Qing had been talking, and Ning Kei had been staring at the source of the sound. How could he be sure when Ning Kei would shoot and avoid it in advance? The arrow hole gradually disappeared. The qi of heaven and earth that was held hostage by the arrow dispersed in all directions, bringing with it countless tiny gusts of wind. Tens of thousands of tiny gusts of wind gathered together to form a violent current. In the whistling sound, the clouds and mist gradually dispersed. Looking at the opposite bank that was gradually becoming clear, Ning Kei's expression became very solemn. Many people appeared on the other side of the river. They were so densely packed that they looked like ghosts hiding among the rocks. These people exuded a powerful aura, and their eyes were dark and cold. Hundreds of gazes were coldly staring at him. The scene was extremely strange and terrifying. These powerful cultivators who followed Long Qing were now like a pack of wolves that had been hungry for many years. Ning Kei saw Long Qing, the man who had quietly said that he was not convinced and made everyone think that he would seek a fair fight with Ning Kei, was now standing at the back of hundreds of powerful cultivators. He was very cautious and extremely dangerous, just like the aura exuding from his body, which gave people an indescribable feeling of complexity. The iron arrow missed, but it was like a signal that the battle had begun. Hundreds of cultivators rushed into the raging river amidst the deafening battle cries. The river upstream was not deep, just knee-deep. For a moment, water splashed everywhere, and the momentum was extremely frightening. Ning Kei did not draw out his iron cutlass. Instead, he held one end of the iron bow and waited silently. The first to arrive were naturally the flying swords. Several shining Taoist swords pierced through the chilly air and the remaining mist. With a hissing sound, they pierced toward his body. Ning Kei did not look at the Taoist swords. He only stared at Long Qing, who was gradually retreating into the depths of the forest behind the crowd. He did not even blink when the Taoist swords left several bright marks in his eyes. Several Taoist swords stabbed into his body almost at the same time. A series of strange sounds rang out from the shore. The sound was so loud that for a moment, it even drowned out the sound of the raging river. The sound was like a child holding a blunt knife, trying to cut open a pork trotter that had been smoked for 10 years, but could only watch in vain as the blade slid across the tough surface, leaving no mark. The sharp Taoist swords could not pierce through his skin at all. In an instant, Ning Kei burned the connection between the Taoist swords and the sword master with Haotian's divine flame. Accompanied by those strange sounds, the Taoist swords bent, and then fell to the ground like scrap iron. He walked forward and suddenly saw that there was a cliff at the end of the valley after the mist dispersed. Under the cliff was a blue kidney sea, which looked very familiar, as if he had been there before. Yes, he had been there before. It was the place where he first met Emo Shanshan and the girls of Black Ink Garden. He suddenly missed her. Since Sang Sang left the human world, he had not thought about her and the other girls for a long time. But today, when the mist dispersed and the blue lake appeared, he suddenly missed them. He did not understand why. Or was it because he was not sure that he could defeat Long Qing, even if he left the shore? Although bones could be buried everywhere in Green Mountain, it was not a bad thing to die here. So he could look back a little. Those cultivators who came to attack on the river were the real powerhouses of Haotian Taoism. They had fought with Long Qing in the Yin Kingdom of the Eastern Wilderness for many years, so their fighting spirits and willpower were not ordinary. At this time, seeing Ning Kei's body was as hard as steel and could completely ignore the cutting of the Taoist swords, They did not feel any fear, nor did they slow down for a moment. The angry river was crushed by the footsteps. Hundreds of powerhouses of Haotian Taoism came from the other shore. They called back the Taoist swords flying in the air, held them tightly in their hands, and stabbed at Ning Quebec. This was the truth that Ji Haoran and Liu Bai taught all cultivators in the world. The closer the natal sword was to oneself, the better, so that the connection would be really close. The closer one was to the enemy, the better, so that he could ignore all defenses. A middle-aged man in leather armor, holding a sword, jumped to the air in front of Ning Ke with an indifferent expression, and chopped down without any fancy moves. The sword was so fast that it did not even have time to make a sound as it tore through the air. This sword was interesting and very powerful. No matter how powerful Ning Ke was, he could not completely ignore such a sword. He looked at the middle-aged man and felt that he was familiar. He remembered that he was a cavalry commander who was expelled from the Divine Hall of Judgment by Yi Hongyu, and was also one of the so-called fallen commanders who later became feared by the world. Ning Ke directly raised the iron bow, held the bow with his left hand, and his right hand fell on the string smoothly. He pulled it casually, and with a light buzz, the bowstring vibrated back to its original position. The cavalry commander was puzzled, because there were no arrows on the iron bow. How could he kill? The next moment, the cavalry commander's face became extremely pale, and a flash of light flashed in his gray eyes. With a roar, he pulled back his sword to protect himself, because he felt the killing intent. There were no arrows on the string of the iron bow, but there was a killing intent. Ning Ke released the string, and there was a sharp killing intent breaking through the air. With a soft sound, a clear corrosion mark appeared on the sword in the hand of the cavalry commander. With a crack, the sword broke in the middle. Then, a thin line of blood appeared on his wrist. Like a ripe fruit falling off the branch, the cavalry commander's hand fell to the ground. Ning Ke raised the iron bow and smashed a cultivator who tried to attack from the side to the ground. Without hesitation, he pulled the bowstring again and released the string at the cavalry commander, who had just fallen to the ground. There was a light buzz, and someone was playing the zither. There was a line of blood on the cavalry commander's body. The line of blood ran from his left shoulder to below his ribs, and it was extremely deep. The next moment, the upper half of his body slipped from the lower half of his body, like a falling mountain. At this moment, the two sides of the turbulent and violent river were quiet for a moment. Today's cough is too uncomfortable, so this is all. Chapter 11:20. Who said that one could not kill without arrows? Many people would say so. When the sound rang in front of the river bank where the clouds and mist had dispersed, no one in the world had ever seen an empty string kill. Because when Ning Ke used the killing intent on the string to cut the commander surnamed Z into dozens of pieces of flesh in the autumn rain in front of the Red Lotus Temple, Long Qing and his subordinates were fleeing down the mountain and did not see that scene. In the autumn rain, Ning Ke knew his destiny. From that moment on, he had the ability to kill with a bowstring. However, he had not used it in the following years. He had hidden this ability in the deepest part of the arrow case. It was only today when he faced the powerful cultivators that he revealed it to the world. Hundreds of powerful cultivators rushed over fearlessly. Ning Ke pulled the bowstring in silence. There was a soft hum. A heavy iron cutlass was cut in half. The powerful cultivator holding the cutlass had his right arm cut off. He let out a painful howl and fell into the river, unable to maintain his balance. A middle-aged man in a Taoist robe roared. The green sword in his hand turned into a swimming dragon, bringing the river water with it, and the vigorous aura of heaven and earth towards his face. He raised the iron bow and pulled the bowstring at the swimming dragon formed by the river water. There was another soft hum. The water dragon was cut in the middle. A crack appeared on the middle-aged man's Taoist robe. The crack expanded rapidly and blood spurted out, dyeing the river water red. He fell heavily into the blood water and could no longer stand up. A powerful cultivator in a leather robe from the eastern tent pulled the bowstring and aimed at the opposite bank across the river. Ning Ke did not even look at it. He pulled the bowstring and shot. The killing intent swept through the surging water. It was wet and had a blurry shape. It arrived in front of the opponent at an unimaginable speed. With a crisp crack, the bow in the hands of the strong Eastern tribe barbarian broke in the middle. The bowstring split into two pieces and scattered in the air. The scattered strings were even more beautiful than the water splashes. The broken bowstring hit him hard in the face, smashing right into his eyes, causing a mixture of blood and juice to splatter out. However, the powerhouse from the eastern tent did not cry out in pain or wail. That was because the killing intent attached to Ning Kei's bowstring did not dissipate after cutting off his bow. Instead, it continued forward and directly cut off his neck. His head fell into the river like a stone. He only needed to bend the bow, and did not need to put an arrow. It was a fake shot, but it had real killing intent. This was how Ning Kei killed people with the iron bow. His movements were steady. His right hand turned into a shadow. Neither sword nor arrow could be faster than the killing intent. Not to mention that killing intent was invisible and intangible. How could one guard against it? The rushing river water was instantly dyed red with blood. In just a single exchange, several experts had fallen to the ground. With his lightning-fast movements of controlling the bowstring, no one was a match for him at all. Ning Kei looked at the figure of Long Qing, who was about to disappear into the forest in the distance, and walked toward the river. At this time, the hundreds of cultivators had all come to his side, and the bloody battle continued. Ning Kei looked at the figure of Long Qing, who was gradually disappearing into the forest in the distance. He walked toward the river. At this time, the hundreds of powerful cultivators had all come to his side. The bloody battle continued. Countless sword talismans, knives, and arrows danced in the air, cutting the air above the river into a turbulent cyclone. Just like the rushing river, there were countless dangers hidden in it. Even with Ning Kei's strong body, he still suffered some injuries under such a high density and intensity of attack. His Black Academy uniform was already torn and blood could be seen faintly under his ribs. But his expression was still calm. He walked silently to the other side of the river. He held the bow with his left hand, and controlled the string with his right. From time to time, he raised his arm to aim, and pulled the string with his right hand. The entire movement was stable to a perfect degree. He was not disturbed by any attacks. Those attacks wanted to kill him, but they could not kill him instantly. Therefore, those who wanted to attack him were all killed by his iron bow. No matter how sturdy the armor the person was wearing, or how strong his body was after practicing martial arts, he could not stop the blood line from penetrating the deepest part of his flesh and bones until he was cut in half, or his limbs were severed, or he died. No one could stop Ning Kei from moving forward, not even those who risked their lives to attack. Hundreds of powerful cultivators were even forced to retreat by him alone. Hundreds of people were led to retreat by an iron bow. The sound of the string kept ringing, buzzing like the sound of a zither. It was very similar to the sound that rang in the square in front of the White Tower Temple in Yueluan Kingdom. The only difference was that eldest brother had broken hundreds of bowstrings that day in order to prevent Ning Kei from being killed. Today, Ning Kei kept pulling the string to kill people as quickly as possible. As he walked and shot, blood splattered and some people fell into the river. Ning Kei walked to the middle of the river. He stood on a slightly protruding rock and looked at the forest on the other side of the river. The river wind blew his hair. He was so silent and powerful. The 200 or so powerful cultivators who were still alive were either standing in the rushing river or on the shore. They looked at him with complicated expressions and temporarily stopped their attacks. It was not easy for an ant to shake a tree. I am invincible in the world. This sentence was used to describe Lu Bai. Ning Kei had not reached that state, but with the iron bow in hand, who in the world could be his opponent in close combat? Ning Kei looked at the forest and said, "Since you are not convinced, you should stand up and fight with me. Why send these people to their deaths?" Long Qing was not by the river. He was in the forest behind the cliff. He looked at the bloody scenes on the river in silence, his expression calm and serene. Ning Kei was very powerful. Although Ning Kei's ability to kill people with only an iron bow was beyond his imagination, he had expected this person to be so powerful. so he was not moved. When Longqing heard Ningke's words, he didn't get angry because he was humiliated and mocked. Instead, he smiled silently because he knew Ningke was joking. He and Ningke would never appreciate each other, because neither of them was a hero. They would never fight for the crown like Junemo and Yi Su, because they were not gentlemen. Ningke used the most powerful primordial 13 arrows to sneak attack. How could he say that he was outnumbered? Longqing knew his shamelessness. In order to defeat him, he had to be even more shameless. He could do anything to win. He could even sell his soul. What else could he care about? Taoism was already in a precarious situation. He would not return to Peach Mountain. The northeast border military of the Tang Empire had penetrated deep into the Yin territory. If his brother made a mistake, capital Chung would be slaughtered. He would not return to the old capital. He did not care about these. He only cared about Ningquebec. Why? Because he was not convinced. How could he be convinced? Of course, he did not want to defeat him openly. He wanted to kill him. If he died, he would naturally be convinced. Between him and Ningke, the one who died first had to be convinced. Longqing understood this. So did Ningquebec. So Ningke's words were just a joke. That was why he laughed. Longqing laughed because he knew he was about to win. Ningke had used up all his fu paper in the city of Wei and the Great Spirit in Qinghe Prefecture. He could still write fu, but he did not have any fu paper. If he wanted to write divine fu, he would need to use his psyche power. He could still use Hao Yan's divine light, but he did not have the Great Spirit that he had accumulated for many years. If he wanted to absorb the qi of heaven and earth into his body, he would need to use a lot of psyche power. Everyone knew that Ningke was the same as Yi Hongyu. They were both peerless geniuses who cultivated in several sections. After Xiahou, it was difficult for anyone to force him to use all his trump cards. It was even more impossible with his current state. However, he had traveled thousands of miles to kill people. Even if he meditated and recovered in the Lang Temple for a period of time, it was impossible for him to be as powerful as when he had just left Chang'an. He could not regain some skills in a short time. What Longqing wanted to do was to force him to use up his psyche power. He lured Ningke to shoot the iron arrow. He made hundreds of the last most loyal and most powerful subordinates attack fearlessly and die one after another. All this was to use up Ningke's psyche power. Psyche power was the foundation of cultivation. It was the firewood for fighting. It was everything. No one had ever thought of using up their psyche power to defeat Ningquebec. This was because his psyche power was extremely powerful. This was also something that many people knew. However, Longqing dared to think this way, because only he knew a fact. No one's psyche power could be stronger than his. Not even Ningke. Tomorrow my wife will be here. Everything will be better. I will recuperate as soon as possible. Then, I will gather enough energy to write the ending of the night. Please encourage me. Thank you. Chapter 1121. Longqing's confidence lay in the fact that he never fought alone. There were many people in his body, and there were also many people by the river. They were the powerful cultivators from Haotian Taoism and the Eastern Royal Court. They were not ordinary cavalries. Even if Ningke could fight against thousands of people, he could not completely ignore the attacks of these powerful cultivators. Ningke also noticed that the situation was a little strange today. None of the cultivators chose to retreat when faced with his iron bow. Instead, they were fearful of death and attacked wave after wave. The cultivator whose arm was cut off by Ningke changed his weapon to another hand and attacked again. The cultivator whose leg was cut off jumped and continued to attack with his companions. Those people looked pale. Every time they jumped, a lot of blood would splash out. They could die at any time, but they did not care. It was a horrifying scene. The horrifying scene meant a horrifying fighting will. Ningke stood on the reef and kept pulling the bowstring. He shot the enemies who approached him into the turbulent river. His expression did not change, but his heart was slightly stirred. How could such a strong and inhuman willpower appear in these people? Suddenly, he noticed that there was something wrong with the eyes of these powerful cultivators. They were not black like the ordinary people of the Central Plains, nor were they brown like the barbarians. Instead, they were a very strange gray, as dim as the lead clouds in the sky. More than 200 powerful cultivators rushed toward the river, surrounded and attacked. No matter how badly they were injured, they were calm and even a little numb. There was no fear in their gray eyes, only a desire to devour people, and even an aura that was close to self-destruction. Looking at these hundreds of pairs of gray eyes, Ning Ke felt that he was surrounded by hundreds of hungry wolves. The surrounding air became a little cold, and he became very vigilant. The movements of his hands gradually slowed down. Slowing down the movements was not to slow down the attack, but to achieve the best effect with each attack. It would be best if he could directly cut off the opponent's waist or neck. If not, then he must at least cut off one of the opponent's legs to make it difficult for them to move and slow down their wolf-like attack. He was so cautious because he felt a sense of crisis deep in his heart. At this time, the river was full of Taoist swords and arrows. The chi of heaven and earth was cut into chaos by hundreds of psyche powers. No matter how fast his attack was, he had to pay a price every time, even if it was a wisp of psyche powers or a strand of hair. No matter how small the price was, it would still affect the final outcome of the battle. For example, an ant's nest was like a 1,000-mile-long dike, or an iron spoon was like a sturdy prison cell. Ning Ke had to be careful. Moreover, the gray eyes of these strong cultivators reminded him of the horrifying cultivation method that Long Qing had cultivated. He would not forget that Long Qing had not made a move until now. He must be hiding in the forest waiting for a chance. The river was still flowing fast, and the clouds had dispersed without a trace. There was no scorching sun in the sky, only a faint light, illuminating the battle on the cliff, and the blue kidney sea not far below the cliff. Ning Ke continued to walk to the other side of the river. People kept falling in front of his iron bow, but at a much slower speed than before. His footsteps became heavier and heavier, just like his dignified expression. Long Qing was indeed looking for a chance, and he was sure that the chance would appear. He and Ning Ke knew each other too well. Conspiracies and tricks did not make much sense. Their states and cultivation methods were exposed to the sky and the sun. The so-called game could only be an open game, and then everything could be calculated. Under the continuous attacks of hundreds of strong cultivators, no matter how strong Ning Ke's psyche power was, it would inevitably be gradually consumed. No matter how cautious he was, he would eventually reveal a loophole. The mottled shadows of the forest leaves fell on Long Qing's face, as if adding countless scars. He quietly and attentively watched the battle in the river, and watched Ning Ke walk down the reef toward him. Ning Ke's movements were still so steady, and his footsteps were also so steady, but too steady. He raised his hand to play the bowstring, and threw his feet into the water. The rhythm was so precise that it was hard to imagine. However, it was this absolutely precise rhythm that gave off a slightly stiff feeling. The feeling of freedom that Ning Ke had shown at the beginning of the battle had unknowingly been worn away by the blood and broken limbs. He could only rely on precision to control the entire battle. If he wanted to control it, it meant that he was about to lose control. This was the chance that Long Qing had been waiting for. Suddenly, a cold and deadly cold wind blew through the forest. A dozen or so birds screeched in fear and scattered in all directions. However, before they could fly over the treetops, they were frozen stiff by the cold wind and fell to the ground. A thin layer of frost appeared on the ground. The frost extended out of the forest until it reached the river bank. It froze the first few waves that came ashore, and then thousands of layers of snow appeared. Long Qing's figure was like a ghost. He appeared on the rapid river, and appeared in front of Ning Quebec. Behind him were two tracks that looked like ruts, faintly imprinted on the frost. The strange phenomenon of ice and snow on the river bank in the forest was caused by him releasing all the aura of quietus without hesitation at this moment. He rushed to Ning Ke at an unimaginable speed. At this time, Ning Ke had just pulled the string of the iron bow and shot a strong warrior from the eastern wilderness in half. He had just lifted his right foot and was about to step on the wet reef in front of him. He raised his hand and then threw his foot. There was a rhythm in between, which was not broken by the horrible sword intent and blade wind on the river. As long as he maintained this rhythm, he could keep moving forward without stopping. Longqing had the power to break his rhythm, and it was at the most critical point of his rhythm. A silent black peach blossom, with an indescribable sense of quietus, descended from above and blasted toward Ning Kei's face. Ning Kei's left hand held the bow handle, and his right hand had just left the bowstring. He was in the follow-up movement of grasping the bird's tail. In a flash, Ning Kei retracted his right hand and held the lower end of the iron bow. His left hand held the middle part of the iron bow, and he pushed his hands forward to block the black peach blossom. The whole movement was done in one breath, as if he had already expected Longqing to appear at this moment. But only he and Longqing knew that it was not a matter of course. His rhythm was broken, and his psyche power was consumed. His right hand that grasped the bird's tail wanted to support the mountain, but after all, it was not enough. Longqing stood on the reef and looked at him expressionlessly. His feet were as steady as roots. Ning Kei was in the river, and his right foot had not yet landed on the reef. He was swaying unsteadily. The dark iron bow was against the black peach blossom. The rushing river was quiet for a moment at this moment. Then there was a loud bang. The black reef under Longqing's feet was broken into countless pieces. Terrifying waves of air surged out in all directions. There was a clear deep plowed mark on the surface of the river. It was the mark of the water being cut open. It was the mark left by Ning Kei's feet on the surface of the river when he was shaken away. He swept across the river like a stone and smashed heavily into the cliff. Smoke and dust filled the air, and the earth shook. The river began to flow again, and it was still as rapid as before. Longqing stood in the river. There was a lot of dust and water on his black divine robe. He was wet, and his hair was messy. His face was pale, and there was blood flowing from the corner of his mouth. He looked extremely embarrassed. However, his eyes were so bright as stars, because he looked at the cliff on the other side of the river. The smoke and dust had dissipated, and there was a dark hole there. No one knew how deep Ning Kei had been smashed into the cliff. Longqing knew that Ning Kei was not dead, but he knew that he had won this head-on battle without any tricks or skills. It was purely a contest of psyche power and state. This was important, so he smiled a little. After a moment, Ning Kei's voice came from the cliff. He sounded a little tired, but still stable. You used so many loyal subordinates to consume my psyche power, and then sneak attacked me. That's too shameless. I see that you are smiling now, and you seem to be very proud? Ning Kei walked out of the cliff and said to Longqing in the river. His front was full of blood, not from the shock of the iron bow, but from coughing. Longqing looked at him and smiled without saying a word. Those powerful cultivators, like hungry wolves, did not wait for orders. They passed by him and killed Ning Kei on the other side of the river. The sound of killing shook the sky again, and the aura of heaven and earth was cut into countless pieces by swords, knives, and arrows. Longqing would not give Ning Kei any time or opportunity to meditate and recover his psyche power. The sound of the iron bow overwhelmed the sound of the surging water again, and began to harvest lives. Everything seemed to be the same as before, but in fact everything was different. Ning Kei's movements were still stable, but more stiff. He still looked calm, but there was an emotion deep in his eyes that no one could understand. Those powerful cultivators were obviously controlled by Longqing's secret method, or at least given some restrictions. After their eyes turned gray, their strength did not increase, but their willpower became extremely terrifying. They really pestered Ning Kei to the extreme, and if they were not killed or smashed, they would cause trouble for Ning Quebec. In many people's minds, as long as one's state was high enough, he could kill all enemies in the world. But they never thought that as long as one was human, he would always be tired, and his psyche power would eventually be exhausted. Ning Kei's psyche power was gradually consumed. It was not exhausted yet, but there were signs. At the moment when the signs appeared, the breath of death appeared on both sides of the angry river again, and the cold-resistant fish under the stones were all frozen. Longqing came to him again. A black peach blossom bloomed and came to his face. Ning Kei did not smell the faint fragrance of the flower, nor would he appreciate the beautiful black petals. He stared at Longqing behind the black peach blossom. His right hand, which was grasping the bird's tail, did not forcibly retract to hold the iron bow. Instead, he took the opportunity to hold the handle of the iron cutlass in the cold wind. There was a clang. The sharp iron cutlass was unsheathed, and the cold wind on the shore paused for a moment, and then tore it apart. He did not look at the black peach blossom that was rushing toward his face, but only stared at Long Qing behind the flower. The iron cutlass passed through the black peach blossom and cut toward Long Qing's face. He was very clear that if he let the situation develop, he might be exhausted to death. Even if he killed all of Long Qing's subordinates, it would be difficult for him to survive after Long Qing gained the upper hand. No matter how he looked at it, it was difficult to survive. Then they could only die together. He looked at Long Qing. He sent an invitation. There's more today. I'm writing slowly. I'm not very sure when the next chapter will come out. Chapter 1122. If they couldn't live together, they had to die together. Apart from describing lovers who would live and die together, it was also sometimes used to describe enemies who couldn't live under the same sky. However, at that time, people would usually change the expression to fight to the death. In fact, when they were in a state of fight to the death, they would often end up dying together. Ning Ke did not care about the black peach blossom that was flying towards him. He directly slashed at Long Qing's face and invited him to die together. He did not really want to die with Long Qing, but he believed that Long Qing would not die with him. So he had to avoid it, and then he could turn the whole situation around. He was very confident about this because he was born in a grassroots family and had struggled between life and death since he was a child. He knew better than anyone that only those who were not afraid of death would not die. On the other hand, Long Qing was born in a noble family and had finally climbed to the peak of life. How could he give up everything in such a short time? Even if Long Qing had learned a lot in the process of climbing out of the abyss and had a new understanding of death and loss, he should also know that in terms of physical strength, few people in this world could be stronger than Ning Quebec. He could not gain any advantage in this kind of brutal killing, so he should also retreat. No matter how he thought about it, Long Qing should retreat and choose to avoid his iron cutlass. Ning Ke thought so. Therefore, when the faint black peach blossom was not affected at all, and resolutely broke the wind and blasted towards his chest with the seemingly endless aura of heaven and earth, he was very puzzled. An intense pain came from his chest and spread around. It was a power that seemed to tear everything apart and directly broke his ribs. Blood kept gushing out, and the world in front of him turned blood red. At the last moment when he could avoid dying together with Ning Ke, Long Qing, who had the initiative, did not choose to retreat. Instead, he silently continued to attack. But for some reason, the spade fell on Ning Ke's chest. With a loud bang, Ning Ke's Black Academy uniform was torn into countless pieces. Blood splashed wildly, and his lips, nostrils, eyes, and ears kept dripping with blood. At the same time, Ning Ke's iron cutlass also fell. It landed heavily on Long Qing's forehead. An extremely terrible muffled sound. He did not wear a silver mask, but his face seemed to be wearing an invisible mask, which was constantly resisting the cutting of the blade. An extremely shrill sound suddenly sounded. Long Qing's face instantly turned pale. His eyebrows and eyes were twisted, as if he was in extreme pain. A shrill howl burst out from his thin lips. The endless aura of heaven and earth was summoned by him, and blasted towards Ning Ke's chest and abdomen through the black peach blossom. Ning Ke was covered in blood. His eyes were dyed red, but he was still calm. He endured the pain that ordinary people would find hard to endure, and used all the strength in his body on the iron saber. The sharp blade went deeper into Long Qing's face, and a stream of blood flowed down. Long Qing's howl became even more shrill, like the howl of a wild wolf in the wilderness, and also like some kind of mournful wail. His eyes became incomparably dark, and his eyebrows fluttered in the wind. His face seemed to be undergoing some sort of change, as his aura gushed out madly. He was about to turn into another person. Ning Ke felt an unprecedented crisis, but he remained silent and continued to slash. Long Qing's roar continued, and his face kept changing. It was as if he could turn into countless people at any time. Following his transformation, a terrifying force covered his face and blocked the iron saber. A black peach blossom fell, and a black iron saber fell. Although there was no immediate outcome of life or death, they both stood on the edge of the cliff. The process seemed to be very long, but in fact it was very short. The cultivators on both sides of the angry river had no time to help Longqing. The two had separated, and the battle had been decided. Naturally, the outcome was also clear. A deafening sound rang out, and the river flew into the sky like a reverse waterfall, shaking up several water curtains that were hundreds of feet high. The mossy stones in the water tumbled and collided with each other, and then shattered. A deep pit appeared on the left bank of the river. Ning Ke fell at the bottom of the pit, bathed in blood, and many bones were broken. Longqing stood outside the pit with a solemn expression. His face was covered in blood, and he looked like a devil. "Do you think I'm afraid of death?" There was no expression on Longqing's face. After saying this, a trace of pain suddenly appeared on his face. He bent down and coughed up 2 mouthfuls of blood. Then he stood up fiercely and repeated, "Do you think I'm afraid of death? To betray one's beliefs is to live a life worse than death. There are countless kinds of psyche power in my body now, and they are struggling with each other. I live a life worse than death every day. Do you think I'm afraid of death?" He roared angrily at Ning Ke, as if he was venting something. "But you're still afraid of death." Ning Ke held onto the edge of the pit and stood up. He looked at him and said, he had suffered such a serious injury, but he still did not fall. It had nothing to do with his state, but his spirit. As Longqing said, his great spirit had turned into the happy wind in Qinghe Prefecture, but his spirit was still there. Longqing did not expect him to still be able to stand up. He said, "I admire you." At this time, there were still dozens of cultivators by the river. They did not die under the iron bow, and they still had the ability to fight. During the short conversation between the two, they all rushed over and raised their swords to attack Ning Quebec. Today's battle seemed to be between Ning Ke and Longqing, but in fact, those cultivators whose states were far lower than the two of them played a very important role in it. The so-called maggots in the bone were just like maggots in the bone. Ning Ke reached out to wipe off the blood on his face. As his palm fell, it swept past his chest and abdomen, and was covered with more blood. Then, he stretched out in the air in front of him and spread his fingers. The blood turned into countless tiny drops of blood, along with the movement of his fingers, and floated around. The river wind blew gently, and he used the blood to write in the wind. His face suddenly became extremely pale, and even the blood on it could not hide it. Countless extremely fierce and sharp talisman intent instantly enveloped the entire river bank. The cultivators around him let out painful, angry, and unwilling howls. They were like war horses that were stopped by a tripwire. Their broken legs and arms fell to the ground one after another. The painful howls mixed with the sound of the river, and it was especially ear-piercing. Longqing's expression did not change. He reached out and waved in the air. The Taoist sword in the hands of a Hautian Taoism priest who had fallen dead in the river came to him. It turned into a clear light in front of him, and cut off the last talisman intent that had quietly attacked him. Ning Ke's expression did not change, even though his sneak attack did not succeed. He looked at him quietly and said, "You see, I can still fight." Longqing stretched out his right hand in the river wind and said, "Please." The angry river suddenly became quiet, because there were angry talisman intents and sword lights everywhere on the river bank. After an unknown period of time, Ning Ke finished writing the talisman. Hundreds of broken Taoist swords were scattered in front of Longqing. The two of them faced each other from a distance. They were covered in blood, their faces were pale, and they were both very tired. It was rare to see such a scene in a battle in the cultivation world. The two of them were so close in their states and knew each other so well that they could only fight with brute force until they were exhausted. They were really exhausted. It was quiet for a long time. The river flowed and sang a song that no one knew what it meant. "Can you still fight?" Longqing asked in an extremely hoarse voice. Ning Ke was silent and looked down at the pool of blood at his feet. It has always been said that your psyche power is more powerful than Lu Bai's. I did not believe it, but today I do. I have spent so much time, and so many subordinates have died to exhaust you. Long Qing said with a faint smile. But you have exhausted yourself, haven't you? Ning Ke looked up at him and said, what about your psyche power? Can you still have it? Long Qing was seen through, but his expression did not change. He said, you failed to kill me with that knife. You have lost. Ning Ke suddenly laughed. This was the first time he laughed since the beginning of the battle. That just means that you are thick-skinned. Long Qing said calmly. This is also an advantage. The problem is that we both have no psyche power now. Why do you think you can defeat me? You should know that I was already very good at killing, when I did not know how to cultivate. Ning Ke took off the iron bow and looked at him. He said, when you took my knife just now, your ankle was broken into pieces. So you can only stand where you are. How can you dodge now? After saying this, he pulled the bow and prepared to shoot. His psyche power was exhausted, and could not shoot the primordial 13 arrows. But he could still shoot arrows. As he said, when he was Mr. 13 of the academy, he could kill people with a snap of his fingers. When he was a soldier at the border of the city of Wei, he was also good at killing people. Killing people had nothing to do with psyche power. At this moment, he was only dozens of feet away from Long Qing. There was no barrier between them. Long Qing's ankle was broken, and he had been standing there for a long time. How could he avoid Ning Ke's iron arrow? If this was Long Qing's trap, then Ning Ke was the one to break it. His way to break the trap was to go with the flow, and achieve his goal according to Long Qing's method. From the very beginning, he knew what Long Qing wanted to do. He was very cooperative. He took the risk, got injured, and continued to cooperate with Long Qing. At the end of the battle, both sides had exhausted their psyche power, and became ordinary people. When they were ordinary people, Long Qing was the prince of the Yin kingdom. But he was the woodcutter of Shibi Lake. Looking at the iron bow in Ning Ke's hand, Long Qing slightly narrowed his eyes. His emotions became extremely complicated. Ning Ke looked calm, and was ready to draw the bow. He felt that the word draw was really good. The battle between him and Long Qing had lasted for several years since that banquet. He had won several battles, but he knew that it was not natural. It was not that he was born to be stronger than Long Qing, or that he was Long Qing's nemesis. It was because of lucky chance or God's will. After Long Qing was defeated by him, many people in the world began to despise Long Qing, except for him. Even though he seemed to not care about Long Qing, in fact, he cared about Long Qing very much. Since he had already won, he did not want to lose to Long Qing again. Because he knew that Long Qing was strong in everything. Among all the enemies in his life, he valued Long Qing the most. When he found Long Qing in the Red Lotus Temple, he did not hesitate to shoot 7 arrows. This was a treatment that no one had ever received. Many years ago, the real feud between them started with the iron arrow on the snow cliff. Many years later, he was ready to end it with the iron arrow by the river of anger. Long Qing suddenly laughed. It was not until then that Ning Ke really saw clearly that the complex emotions in Long Qing's eyes were nothing else but a combination of mockery, contempt, sympathy, and some confusion. A person whose psyche power was exhausted, unable to move, and could only wait to be shot to death by the arrow would not have such an emotion. This kind of emotion only belonged to the winner. Those emotions disappeared in the next moment. Because emotions had colors, and Long Qing's eyes had no color. There was no black, no white, no light, no evil, just a gray. It was like the sky of Chengjing City in winter, when every household burned coal. It was like a Taoist scroll that was wet, and could not be dried again. It was chaotic, gray, evil, and horrible. His right hand hung by his side. Several Taoist priests were on the riverbank in the direction of his right hand. They were dying. All of a sudden, the facial features of these few heavenly officials twisted in pain. Long Qing closed his eyes and took a deep breath, looking very intoxicated. When he opened his eyes, there seemed to be many more souls in his gray eyes. He looked at Ning Ke and waved. Countless grains of sand on the riverbank flew with the wind, making a sizzling sound like thousands of sharp arrows. Clap, 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 clap. There were dense sounds of hitting, and countless bloody holes appeared on Ning Kei's body. The iron arrow fell at his feet. He could no longer stand and knelt on one knee. Your biggest mistake is being too confident. Do you really think that your psyche power is the best in the world? Maybe I used to be, but not after I cultivated the gray eyes. I have thousands of incarnations and countless psyche power. How can you be my opponent? Longqing walked towards him, and his broken ankle seemed to have recovered. Behind him, countless blurry faces vaguely appeared. He walked to Ning Kei, spread his hands, and pointed at the seriously injured cultivators and corpses on the riverbank. He said, "As long as I want, I can get psyche power at any time. I brought them to kill you, first to consume your psyche power, and also to replenish myself at the last moment. They are my food, and they could have been yours." Longqing looked at Ning Kei and said, "This is a feast that I have arranged for you and me. I don't understand why you are still unwilling to enjoy it at the last moment. If so, then you can only be the last main dish." "Why not?" "Because human flesh is not delicious." Ning Kei coughed out 2 mouthfuls of blood and pain. Only then did he know why Longqing was confused. Longqing must have been waiting for him to use the practice of Taotai to deal with his gray eyes, just like in the autumn rain in front of the Red Lotus Temple many years ago. But he did not expect that it would still be useless, even when he was at the end of his rope. He looked at Longqing and continued, "I have eaten your flesh, and it is not delicious either." Longqing had long been prepared for Ning Kei to use the practice of Taotai. For this reason, he had used some tricks on the cultivators by the riverbank. But he did not expect that Ning Kei did not move, just because of such a simple reason. Is it important whether it is delicious or not? Very important. Ning Kei said, "My teacher taught me many things, but I only remember this one." Longqing said no more. He raised his right hand, and the riverbank was shrouded in the aura of quietus. Hundreds of cultivators, regardless of whether they were alive or dead, began to tremble slightly. His eyes became darker and darker. In a very short time, he regained his strength. He pulled out his life-bond sword from his tattered black divine robe. The sword that looked like a black peach blossom, the sword or the flower, was born from the hole in his chest. He finally defeated Ning Kei today. Ning Kei was about to die. This made him extremely happy, and he was overjoyed. So the black peach blossom on the sword was in full bloom, extremely beautiful. In the process of the black peach blossom blooming and then falling, Ning Kei thought of many things. This was not the backtracking of time before his death, because he did not think that he was about to die. He just thought of the academy's climbing test. At the wooden door, Longqing should have seen that a gentleman did not compete, but he saw that a gentleman did not use a tool. What was the academy's no-tool spirit? He had asked Chen Pippi about it, but found that it was a very mysterious concept, and everyone's understanding was different. The metaphysical was called the Tao, and the metaphysical was called the tool. The no-tool was the Tao, or was it not rigidly bound by rules, like the headmaster of the academy, who really had no rules? Ning Kei still had a long way to go before he could reach the state of no rules and great freedom. But at this moment, he vaguely understood some of the truth. There were many things in the world that could not be calculated. Just like Longqing, no matter how carefully he calculated, there would still be many accidents. For example, in this feast, he still refused to raise his chopsticks. On the contrary, if he only followed his heart and did not think about the consequences, he might have a better ending. What was the point of thinking so much about the so-called trump card and the so-called response? When Ning Kei was thinking about these things, he still lowered his head and half knelt at the bottom of the pit. His right hand was full of blood, and he held the iron bow. He waved the iron bow and waved it forward. He did not look at it, nor did he think. He waved it casually, but it was so free and easy. Longqing wanted to avoid it, but found that he could not. Ning Kei waved the iron bow, as if he had written in Chang'an. It turned out that writing talisman was really the same as writing. The more unintentional, the better. The chicken soup calligraphy had no owner when it was written, so it was best to make everyone feel touched. His waving was unintentional, so he could not avoid it. There was a crisp sound. Long Qing's ankle, which had been barely repaired, broke again, and his body tilted and fell. The iron bow in Ning Kei's hand had already passed through the river wind and was around Long Qing's neck. Long Qing shouted and held the Taoist sword backward, using the black peach blossom on the sword hilt to block the tough bowstring. The two fell on the river bank, and the blood on their bodies was smeared with mud. Ning Kei lifted his right knee like lightning, pressed it against his back, and pulled the iron bow, trying to strangle him with the bowstring. Long Qing held the black peach blossom sword upside down, and the sword edge was about to touch his chest. He forced out all the psyche power in his sense of perception, and summoned countless auras of heaven and earth. But he could not get out. Ning Kei's power seemed to be especially terrifying at this moment. There seemed to be only two ways for Long Qing: to be strung by the iron bow, or to be stabbed to death by his own sword. There was a soft sound. The sword edge pierced through his clothes and stabbed into Long Qing's body. But he did not die, because there was a hole in his chest and abdomen. The dark black sword pierced through the hole. There was a puff. Ning Kei's chest was pierced by the sword edge, and blood gushed out. The hole in Long Qing's chest was made by Ning Kei with an arrow. Now he used this hole to stab a deep bloody hole in Ning Kei's chest. Or was this cause and effect? The bowstring was only an inch away from Long Qing's neck. The black sword was also only an inch away from Ning Kei's heart. The choice was in Long Qing's hands. If he did not use the sword hilt to block the bowstring, the sword edge could continue to penetrate into Ning Kei's body. But then his neck would also be cut by the bowstring. The choice was also in Ning Kei's hands. If he did not continue to strangle Long Qing with the bowstring, then Long Qing's sword would not continue to penetrate into his body. This was a true sharing of life and death. In the mud on the river bank, there was only the sound of rapid breathing, and only the silent struggle for life. They were all people who survived like wild dogs. No matter how high they climbed, in the end, they still had to bite each other like wild dogs. Long Qing could not turn his head, and asked while panting, "What method did you use when you waved the bow just now? Why couldn't I avoid it? Since it has nothing to do with psyche power, why didn't you use it before?" Ning Kei said behind him, "The Academy's no-boundary spirit." Long Qing asked with a trace of cruelty, "What now? Die together." Ning Kei said, "I don't mind." During the short conversation, the two were actually still exerting force. The bowstring made a squeaking sound, and the sword edge pierced into Ning Kei's body slowly. Long Qing suddenly said, "You don't dare, because you don't want to die, and you still want to find her." Ning Kei said, "Not wanting to die doesn't mean that I am afraid of death. What you said proves that you are afraid of death." Long Qing seemed to be greatly insulted, and shouted angrily, "How can I be afraid of death?" Ning Kei said, "At the beginning, your natal peach blossom did not hit my face but my chest. Because you lowered your head, you only dared to use your forehead to meet my knife, but not your neck." Long Qing panted and said, "So what? You lowered your head, but I didn't." Ning Kei took a few breaths of the air with the smell of mud, and said expressionlessly, "So you die, and I live." As soon as he finished speaking, he used all his remaining strength to pull the bow backward. Long Qing let out an angry roar. The bowstring fell on his neck, leaving a clear line of blood. The black sword edge pierced into Ning Kei's chest, piercing his heart. An indescribable and absolute pain spread throughout Ning Kei's body, making him tremble uncontrollably. His face was as pale as snow, and his lips were as black as ink. He screamed in pain. "Ah!" Ning Kei screamed in pain, and his hands kept pulling backward. A light sound was heard. Long Qing's neck was broken. His whole body lost its strength, and he lay on the mud like a puppet falling apart. Ning Kei breathed rapidly, and his eyes were a little unfocused. His hands holding the bow kept trembling. It was not until a long time later that he became slightly sober. He let go of the bow with difficulty and rolled to the side. There was an extremely deep bloody hole in his chest, and his heart was seriously damaged. He curled up into a ball in pain, hugging his arms, and kept trembling. The wind by the river was cold and refreshing, because his heart was exposed in the bloody hole. Long Qing was lying beside him. He looked at the dark sky with confusion and bewilderment. At this moment, his eyes were no longer gray. Compared to this long story, the ending was so simple and came so quickly. Just as Ning Ke said, if Long Qing was not afraid of death, his black sword could definitely pierce through Ning Ke's heart by combining his strength with Ning Ke's. But then he would also die. These years Long Qing lived in pain, but he did not want to die. At the last moment, he still did not want to die. So he died. Chapter 11:23. Thick clouds covered the sky, making it dark and gloomy. In the distance at the bottom of the cliff, the blue kidney sea was tranquil and beautiful. No one disturbed it. The stream between the cliffs flowed unbridledly, emitting rumbling sounds. It seemed extremely cheerful. After a long time, Ning Ke woke up. His face was extremely pale due to the loss of blood, and he looked confused. It took him a while to really wake up and remember what had happened. He covered his badly wounded chest with one hand and tried to stand up, but found it very difficult. Such a simple movement took him a long time and brought him endless pain. His academy uniform was tattered, and the blood all over his body was frozen by the cold air. He looked like a ghost who had just escaped from hell. After the battle, the big black horse rushed out of the forest and stayed by his side. Seeing his weak appearance, it hurried to his side and supported him with its warm and solid body. Ning Ke gently stroked its neck with his left hand and forced a smile to express his gratitude. Then he looked around and saw corpses everywhere on the beach and in the river. But the blood in the water had been diluted, so it was hard to see. The hundreds of cultivators, who were as terrifying as hungry wolves, were all dead. Many died under his iron bow, and many more died under Long Qing's hands. The faces of the dead had a very strange gray color, and they looked very haggard. It should be the result of Long Qing absorbing all of their psyche power. Ning Ke noticed that there were dozens of dead birds beside the corpses of the priests. There were still some traces of blood and flesh in the birds' beaks. It seemed that these people had been implanted with some kind of poison. Long Qing's body was at his feet. It was still staring at the gray sky, unwilling to die. He did not have the habit of collecting the bodies of his enemies, but he wanted to find something on Long Qing's body. He squatted down and began to search carefully, but he found nothing in the tattered black robe. Unexpectedly, he found that there were some faint golden reflections in Long Qing's wounds. He frowned slightly, not understanding what they were. He picked up the iron arrow on the ground and pierced it into Long Qing's body. He picked out the golden things and found that they were very thin golden threads. And there were more than one. They were everywhere. Ning Ke only knew that a madman in the cultivation world had done something similar. Yi Hongyu had planted many golden threads in her body to counter his practice of Tao Tai. He did not expect Long Qing to do the same. The poison implanted in the bodies of those cultivators, and the golden thread implanted in Long Qing's body, were naturally a trap for him. In the previous banquet, Long Qing had used the gray eyes to absorb the psyche power of his subordinates. If Ning Ke had responded with the Tao Tai, he would have fallen into his trap. No one could predict the outcome of the battle. Ning Ke looked at Long Qing's eyes, which were brighter after death than when he was alive, and remained silent. There were many key points in today's battle. He had refused to use the Tao Tai, which was completely out of his opponent's expectation. A long time ago, he and the headmaster of the academy had talked about this matter. The master and disciples' attainments in food were as different as heaven and earth, but they had reached an unprecedented consensus in this regard. Human flesh really did not taste good. They were able to have this kind of discussion because both master and disciple had done such crazy things before. Of course, if it really came to a moment of life and death, such as when he carried Sang Sang on his back to escape in the barren land many years ago, or he would still eat anything, what would the Tao Tai be? The reason why he did not use it today was that he always thought Long Qing would have other means, the strongest one. That was also the reason why he searched for Long Qing's body. Unexpectedly, he did not find it. The Sha, hand scroll of the Tomes of Arcane had always been with Long Qing. In the capital of the Kingdom of Song, he used this Tomes of Arcane, to break the river and mountain sandbox of Fourth Brother. There were still some remnants of the tomes of Arcane, but where was it now? The Academy now attached great importance to the 7 tomes of Arcane, or to be exact, the 6 tomes of Arcane in the hands of Taoism. When Yu Yen and Junemo were looking for the butcher in the small town in front of Peach Mountain, they were also looking for the fall hand scroll of the tomes of Arcane, in the hands of the middle-aged Taoist. So did Ning Quebec. Now that they had confirmed that the tomes of Arcane were not with the original owner, they must be in the hands of the Abbey Dean. What did the Abbey Dean want to do with them? Needless to say, they must be extremely important. Ning Ke stood where he was and thought for a while. When he recovered a little, he patted the big black horse's neck. The big black horse knew that he was ready to leave, so it did not wait for him to turn over. Instead, it slightly bent its front hooves and arched to the side. Then it lifted Ning Ke, who was exhausted and powerless, onto the saddle. Then it stepped on the soft river bank and left. Holding the big black horse's neck, he noticed that its front hooves were stained with blood. Thinking that Long Qing's horse was missing, he seemed to understand something. Then, his attention was attracted by the clouds and mist that appeared between the cliffs again. The big black horse ran down the cliff and continued northward along the Blue Kidney Sea. It stopped by the steaming hot spring for a night. Ning Ke soaked in the hot water and meditated to make sure that his injury would not worsen. Then he was relieved. He leaned against the edge of the pool and looked at the floating hot mist. He did not think about the stories that happened many years ago. Instead, he felt that the mist was very similar to the clouds and mist in the cliffs. There was no difference. This battle was very bloody and tragic. But he also learned something. For example, he understood a saying. At the end of the mountain and the end of the river, there were white clouds. There was no need to think about whether there was a path in the depths of the clouds. There was no need to think about whether there was a light at the end of the tunnel. There was no need to look for villages and hunting villages. He thought so the moment he waved the iron bow and did so. It was not necessary to be more evil to defeat evil. It was not necessary to be more violent to defeat violence. It was not necessary to use the practice of Taotai to defeat the gray eyes. Follow your heart, and you may see freedom. This might be the real no-boundary spirit of the Academy. It was also the true meaning of the 4 words that the headmaster of the Academy let him see on the stone behind the wooden door. It was also a kind of teaching. Ning Ke understood. He knew very well how important it was. If he really wanted to write that big character one day in the future, he must understand this truth. This battle also gave him some psychological hints. Because it was too painful, too bitter and too miserable, he always felt that this should be the last pass before he traveled thousands of miles to see Tianyan. He took out the stone statue and looked at Sang Sang, who was lying quietly in the mist. He said quietly, "You have to wait for me." After leaving the Blue Kidney Sea, Ning Ke rode the big black horse and continued northward. The eastern wilderness grassland was full of charred tents and corpses of war horses. The desolate man defeated the last cavalry of the left king's palace, so no one would disturb him. It was strange that he did not go to the desolate man for supplies or clues. He seemed to be extra careful. He went all the way to the north and came to the valley guarded by Helan City. He stopped the big black horse and looked around to see that there was no one around. He put his finger to his lips and blew a very clear whistle. The sound of the whistle traveled far into the mountains and ridges. Some birds were startled, some beasts growled, and then there was the sound of hurried hooves going far away. Ning Ke waited in the same place for 3 days. On the morning of the 4th day, when the sun had just risen, a very handsome wild horse galloped in the morning light. Its long mane danced in the wind, and its strong body was drenched in sweat. It looked very beautiful. "It is much more handsome than you." Ning Ke looked at the wild horse and said to the big black horse. To his surprise, the big black horse only snorted and did not make any more aggressive moves to express its opposition, such as acting coquettishly or acting cute. The wild horse galloped to Ning Ke and stopped in front of him. It lowered its head and sent a message. Ning Ke recognized that this horse was one of the 8 horses in front of the black donkey's broken chariot. He reached out and patted it to express his gratitude. Then he began to read the message that Gaga had ordered countless creatures on the grassland to inquire about. The big black horse approached the wild horse and tried to show affection by rubbing its neck. The wild horse raised its head to show its pride and disdain, but it did not leave. Ning Ke then realized that this unusually handsome wild horse was actually a female horse. Gaga used some unknown means to make a human understand its consciousness. It even made the human write a letter. The words in the letter were very simple, and the meaning was very clear. In the cold north, the most cunning snow fox and the most vigilant snow chicken are dying one after another. There are no wild horses and snow wolves that have seen the beast that is good at hunting, but there must be such a beast. Ning Ke finished reading the letter and looked to the north. It was the same as what the stone statue had predicted. They were all in the north. The headmaster of the academy once said that the north of all places was in one place. No one found any trace of her, but they found traces left by a fierce beast. That beast was either an indigo dog or an indigo lion. Ning Ke's expression did not change, but his hand holding the letter became a little stiff. He turned over and mounted the horse, lightly clamping its belly, and headed north. The handsome wild horse quietly saw him off at the entrance of the gorge. The big black horse lowered its head and looked a little unhappy. Ning Ke said, "I know you want to find a companion, but I have to find mine first." The wind and snow gradually became stronger as they headed north. Ning Ke calmed himself down and was cautious and silent. He did not meet with the desolate man, and even paid attention not to leave any traces on the snow. He did not want anyone to find his whereabouts, and thus find her. He moved forward in the mountains abandoned by Haotian. He was the person abandoned by Haotian. In other words, he had abandoned Haotian in the human world. Now he was going to find her. He arrived at the hot sea. There was no heat, only thick snow and bone-chilling coldness. Ning Ke led the big black horse and walked in the wooden houses abandoned by the desolate man. He recalled the scene when the headmaster brought him and sang here, and the wedding witnessed by Master Heaven and Earth. The stone statue in his arms was also very warm, which told him that he had come to the right place. She should be here. But where was she? He walked to the window of a wooden house and looked at the dark snow sea and the unimaginably high mountain. There was an oil lamp in the window. Sang looked at him quietly. Her face was like the silver moon, illuminated by the dim light. She could see him. He could not see her. They were people from two different worlds. Ning Ke stood by the window for a long time, until his eyebrows were dyed white by the snow. When he walked to the forest, he suddenly stopped. He looked at a place under the tree, and his hand holding the reins began to tremble. The more I wrote, the more cautious I became, and the more I didn't want to continue. I really love the people at night. Last night, after Long Qing died, I was able to sleep peacefully. This is the truth. I also love you very much. Chapter 1124. Just like the title. That leaf slip was awesome. It was called The Last Deep Breath. I wrote it full of murderous intent. I even coolly pulled monthly votes at the end. In the end, I realized that I had forgotten to post it. Oh my. I'm guilty. I apologize to everyone, especially to my friends who waited for me yesterday. I cried as I went to work. I've let everyone down. I've let down my Weeping Blood chapter. Today's update would be around 8 p.m. sharp. Chapter 1125. Yesterday, I forgot to post my request for leave. It's really a sin. Although I often stop updating, I have never stopped updating without asking for leave. That's because I'm worried that the readers will wait for me to update and waste their time. I didn't expect to make such a big mistake. I'm really sorry. I still have one more chapter today. I'll be writing very slowly. Write slowly and seriously. Also, this chapter is quite sour and kind of, but I really like this style. There were some leftover chicken bones under the tree. Ning Ke looked at those chicken bones and was silent for a long time. The big black horse snorted uneasily and looked back at the wooden hut, feeling a little uneasy. Ning Ke suddenly turned around and led it back to the wooden hut. He pushed the door open and entered. The hut was still dark without a trace of light. It was empty and there was no one. Ning Ke let go of the reins and walked to the window, looking at the snow sea. The oil lamp on the table was lit. Sang Sang looked at him quietly. He still couldn't see her, but he knew she was here. So he began to speak. Long Qing is dead. He paused for a while and continued. In the north of Yin Kingdom, I killed him. I didn't expect it to end so easily. In my original plan, I was going to disable him, and then lock him in the front gate of the Devil's Doctrine, so that he would never be free, just like what youngest uncle did to Lotus. But after thinking about it, it didn't make sense. He didn't really offend me, except that his attitude towards you was a little bad, and he tried to threaten me with you. But none of that happened. Lotus killed Xiao Xiao. He didn't hurt you. My reaction was a little too intense. Ning Ke turned around and looked at the dark room. He said, ever since I found you beside that barkless mulberry tree, the most intense emotions in my life have been because of you. At first I wanted to kill my grandpa. Then I came to Longqing. Now that I think about it, when I first entered the city of Wei, I fought several times for you. Sang Sang was very close to him. If there was no barrier, they could hear each other's breathing. Listening to his words, her expression was still cold, but her eyelashes fell slowly. She seemed a little tired. I went to the Lank Temple and carved a lot of stone statues. Your statue. Ning Ke took out the stone statue from his arms and put it on the table in front of the window. He said, I don't know if you still remember what you said in the temple when you were sick, but I still remember it. Sang Sang looked at the table and at herself, who was sleeping on her side, with a curious look in her eyes. Of course, I went to the city of Wei first. I always thought that it was more important to you and you might stay there. Unfortunately, I couldn't find you. Well, I killed a lot of people there. Ning Ke suddenly stopped. After a long silence, he said, I don't want to talk anymore. It's meaningless to cry and stab myself to force you to come out. Anyway, I'm here. He looked at the empty darkness in front of him and said, come out. There was no need to be emotional, no need to reminisce, just a calm request, just like in the past many years. You bring me tea, you pour me water, you put your feet in my arms, and let me touch them. In the quiet wooden house, there was an almost inaudible sound, as if the thinnest paper was cut by the sharpest knife, or the most brittle glass fell from the sky to the ground, breaking and then opening. The dim light gradually filled the whole room, from a trace to tens of thousands, and finally illuminated the whole wooden house. The stone statue lying on the table, Ning Ke's face, and her figure. Ning Ke looked at her, who he hadn't seen for a long time. He looked at her swollen waist and her simple animal skin clothes. He felt inexplicably sad and stepped forward to hold her tightly in his arms. Sang Sang expressionlessly let him hold her. She raised her head, looking extremely arrogant or perhaps dull. Let go, she said. The indigo lion rushed out from the corner, its forelimbs bent, and it was about to pounce, growling threateningly. The big black horse stared at it from above. Its eyes were violent, and its meaning was clear. The indigo lion quickly stopped growling and became well-behaved. Ning Ke held Sang Sang and buried his head in her neck. His voice was a little muffled, but it was very clear. The muffled tone meant that it was clear, and the meaning was unquestionable. No, Sang Sang said coldly, let go. Ning Ke said, no, let go, let go, let go. No, I said I won't let go, and I won't let go. The big black horse and the indigo lion looked at each other, and sensibly walked to the corner, pretending that they didn't see or hear anything. Ning Ke held Sang Sang like this, as if he would hold her until the seas ran dry and the rocks rotted. After an unknown period of time, Song Song's slightly raised head finally fell back down. Their cheeks touched each other warmly. After a long time, Ning Ke was sure that the handle of the axe had not rotted into dust. He finally let go of his hands, grabbed her right hand, and led her to the bed to sit down. They sat side by side on the bed, not to share the fruits equally. But if Sang Sang put on the cape, it would look like the night of their wedding. It was here that they had consummated their marriage. Come home with me, Ning Ke said to her. Sang Sang did not answer him, nor did she pull her hand out of his. She looked at the wind and snow outside the window, lost in thought. Ning Ke knew that she was not lost in thought. because she was a god, and she was still here. Come home with me, he repeated. Sang Sang looked at him and asked expressionlessly, which home? Your first home. This time it was Ning Kei's turn to be silent. Sang Sang said, the headmaster wanted to break my world because of his irresponsible desire for freedom. You are so persistent in breaking my world because you want to go back to that home? In fact, I have always wanted to know, when were you sure that you could go back to your hometown after breaking my world? Ning Kei held her hand tightly, thought for a while and said, in fact, I have guessed this a long time ago, because there are also stars here. And the headmaster finally became the moon. Sang Sang slightly raised her eyebrows and asked, what does this mean? He became the moon because you told him about the moon on the sea that year. And he thought the moon was beautiful. That's all. There is wind and snow. Ning Kei pointed out of the window and said, and the sky full of stars. These are all very unnecessary things. If your world is a closed and self-contained system, you don't need the 4 seasons. But you have all these long ago. Your world is very similar to the one I came from. He withdrew his gaze from the window and looked at her. There is only one explanation. This world is still in the world that I am familiar with. And it is interconnected, or at least observable, because only by observing can one imitate and be so similar. Sang Sang said indifferently, you can observe, so I know what your world is like. Ning Kei said, it is a vast and free world. Sang Sang said, it is a cold and dead world. The passionate sun spread life, and the boundless universe was waiting to be explored, so it was a vast and free world. But most of the space was filled with absolute coldness and silence, so it was also a cold and dead world. Ning Kei and Sang Sang were not wrong, because they had different standpoints. Ning Kei was silent for a long time, and then said, the fate of human beings should be decided by human beings. You don't have to continue to bear this responsibility. It is too tiring. Sang Sang said, I once told you that I love the world, and only the people who love me. The ancestors of the world chose me, so I have to continue to bear this responsibility. This discussion is meaningless. Ning Kei forcefully stopped the conversation, grabbed her shoulders and said, you are my wife, and you are pregnant with our child. You should go home with me. Sang Sang looked at him quietly for a long time, and then said, do you want me to die so badly? Ning Kei said, that day when you sailed to the divine kingdom on the other side of the sea, I tried to do something, but in the end, I did nothing. You should be very clear about my attitude. Sang Sang said, but I also warned you that I am the aggregation of the rules of this world. If you want to destroy this world, I can no longer continue to exist. Ning Kei said, I used to be very worried, but not now, because there is Haotian in the divine kingdom, and you have become a person now. You will be fine. Chapter 1126. Sang Sang was still calm and proud, as indifferent as when she was on the Peach Mountain or in the mortal world. She did not show any extra emotions. In fact, she was very uneasy, because she knew what the Abbey Dean wanted to do. Her relationship with Taoism was very complicated. She was the deity worshipped by Taoism, and also the gatekeeper chosen by Taoism for human beings. When Taoism decided to destroy her, it meant that the human world would abandon her. She was getting weaker and could be killed now. So for the first time, she felt the reality and sadness of life. She began to feel fear and uneasiness, which eventually turned into sadness. So she shed tears expressionlessly. Fortunately, the night was very dark, and there was a dim lamp lit up, because it was the only one. Just like the human world was already dark for her, there was still Ning Kei, the only exception. He was the only one she trusted, because he was her man. Because she had poured tea for him many times, spent a long time with him, and experienced countless life and death situations together. They were already inseparable. Sang Sang closed her eyes and leaned on his chest. She looked a little tired, but the indifference between her brows had been replaced by peace. Since the day she could not return to the divine kingdom, This was the only time she could truly feel at ease. Ning Ke hugged her from behind and said, "We will go back tomorrow. When we arrive in Chang'an, no one can hurt you. Don't forget that you are Haotian. You used to be so fierce to me. But why are you so timid now?" Sang Sang did not answer his question about going back to Chang'an. She said, "I am not as powerful as I used to be, so I have to be careful. As for you, you have been so disrespectful to me, but I did not punish you. You should be grateful." Hearing this, Ning Ke reached his hand down from her hair into her chest and held there. He said, "You are my wife. Even if you treat each other with respect, it should be on the banquet table. We are on the Kong bed." Sang Sang suddenly opened her eyes. A trace of anger flashed in the depths of her eyes, which were as bright as stars. Then she became a little confused. If she wanted to become a human, it seemed that there was nothing wrong with his behavior. Feeling that the hand in her chest was getting hotter and hotter, she frowned. It was obvious that she was not used to it, but she did not know how to deal with it. This kind of intimacy was common in her human memory. From her childhood to Chang'an, especially in that chessboard, she did not know how many times, but she still found it hard to accept. She was considering whether she should continue to remain silent and pretend that she didn't know, or wave her hand to disperse her world and blast him into the depths of the sea of snow to wake him up. For some reason, she chose to remain silent. In order to dispel the discomfort and embarrassment in the depths of Tian Xian's heart, she chose to discuss a relatively cold topic with him. "Chen Mao wants to kill me," she said expressionlessly. As she wished after hearing this, Ning Ke's hand was still in her arms, but at least he stopped moving. After a while, his voice came from behind her ear. "Are you sure? I know everyone's past, so I know their future. In a closed world, as long as you know all the prerequisites, grasp all the rules, and have absolute computing ability, you can calculate all the results. I understand that." She knew that this was the language used in Ning Ke's world. After hearing it for so many years, she was used to it and did not want to ask. She repeated, "So Chen Mao wants to kill me." This was a typical reason of Haotian, or a miracle. The Ming hand scroll of the Tomes of Arcane was the specific manifestation of this miracle, and it was her declaration to the entire human world. After a moment of silence, Ning Ke said, "Senior brothers and sisters and I have vaguely guessed it, but we can't be sure, because we don't know what he wants to do." Sang Sang did not say it, but it was obvious that she was fully prepared for this. "In fact, I have always been wondering, if you can calculate the future, just like what is written in the Ming hand scroll, you know that the headmaster will turn into the moon, that the Buddha will hide in the mountains, and that the Abbey Dean will find another way. Then why did you come to the human world? You did not completely defeat the headmaster, but you became weaker and more dangerous." Ning Ke held her in his arms and asked in a low voice. Sang Sang said, "I can't calculate my own future. The future I saw in the past is too vague, and I can't be sure, because there are variables." "What is a variable?" "A person like your headmaster who can go beyond the rules is a variable." "It sounds very powerful. You are also a variable." "Why?" "Because you are an outsider." The room was quiet for a while, and the wind and snow outside the window kept roaring. Sang Sang was right. In fact, many years ago, when Li Qingshan, the nation master of Tang, used his lifespan as a substitute to calculate the future, he also saw something special about Ning Ke. He was never in this chess game. He came from another world, and he was an outsider. Haotian could not calculate him, the headmaster of academy could not see him, and the Abbey Dean was the same. Ning Ke was silent for a long time. He felt that the identity of the headmaster of academy was like some kind of messenger that often appeared in religions, but he did not know whether it was the messenger of light or the messenger of darkness. It was still too heavy, and did not fit the atmosphere of the reunion of the husband and wife at the end of 1,000 miles to find his wife. He decided to change the topic from Sang Sang. "When is it due?" He touched her bulging belly and asked with concern. Sang Sang's answer was very simple. "I don't know." This answer stunned him, and he felt a little strange. He thought to himself, Don't you know when you don't have your menstruation? But on second thought, his wife was not a human, and it was indeed hard to explain. If it was calculated according to the 10 months of pregnancy of an ordinary person, he was wearing a very green hat. He stopped thinking about these trivial things and asked another question that was equally important. A boy or a girl? Do you want a boy or a girl? Sang Sang did not turn around, but her eyes became a little bright. It seemed that she had thought about these questions a lot during these days of solitude in the cold region. He did not know if she had found that she was really like a human. Either is fine. Ning Ke thought for a while and said, but a girl is better. I have more experience raising her. The experience he was talking about was the time when he raised Sang Sang as a child. Sang Sang nodded and said, I don't know if it's a boy or a girl. Ning Ke was a little annoyed and said, why don't you know? Ordinary pregnant women knew their due date, but without the help of a doctor, there was no way to know whether the baby was a boy or a girl. But for an extraordinary pregnant woman like Sang Sang, it should be the opposite. Shouldn't Hao Yin know everything? Because I don't want to know, Sang Sang said in a low voice. She looked a little angry, but it was more like she was acting in a fit of pique. She was still tall and plump, especially after she was pregnant. But lying in his arms and acting in a fit of pique, she looked a little cute, like a little girl. Ning Ke heard more jealousy in her voice. He knew that she was jealous, just like when she ran away from home in Chang'an. But now she was jealous of the child in her belly. No matter who he was jealous of, it was still jealousy. This was what he wanted to see the most in his life. So he laughed heartlessly and hugged her even tighter. Of course, he was careful not to press against her stomach. The two of them lay quietly on the bed. The stone statue lay quietly on the table. The big black horse and the indigo lion rested quietly in the corner of the room. Not long after, the sky was still dark. But according to the time, it was morning. Ning Ke got up and began to pack up, ready to leave with her. Sang Sang looked at him quietly and did not say that she wanted to leave with him. After packing up, Ning Ke walked to her and said, don't play the game of not taking the initiative, not refusing, and not taking responsibility. No matter whether you want to leave or not, you have to go with me. After saying this, he carried her in his arms. The big black horse was very observant. It jumped like lightning and humbly lowered its body. After Sang Sang rode on it, it turned back and carefully rubbed against her calf to show affection. Chapter 11:27. The group members testified that they had been thinking hard and struggling. But if they couldn't get the best, they would stop for a day. After all, it was the most important moment. No matter how cautious they were, it made sense. Tomorrow's update would definitely be extremely late, because I would have to spend a long time to think through some things. The group touched everyone. Chapter 11:28. Ning Ke did not know what to say. He looked at the bubble floating in front of her and thought of the speculations he and his teacher had made on the ship. He asked uncertainly, is this what the world looks like? Sang Sang did not answer. The wind and snow did not stop. The big black horse was very fast. It did not take long for them to cross the snow sea. Ning Ke looked back and saw the clear hoof prints on the snowfield. No one knew what he was thinking. Everyone who walked would leave a trace. This sentence was a bit sour and nonsense. But it was a simple truth for what he wanted to do. Weren't the most important changes of human beings to the world those traces? For example, the city wall, the palace, the fields, and the river bank. The trace on the snow sea was the same. It was also a part of a certain stroke of a word. It could be the beginning or the end. But Ning Ke could not be sure at the moment. Even he could not be sure, unless he really wrote that word and let the whole world see it. But it was not easy to write that word. Looking back at the history of human beings in this world, only the headmaster of the academy was able to surpass the rules and reach the state of no rules. But he had to make some preparations, even if it would take him thousands of years. Before he was sure of the Abbey Dean's real purpose, this was probably the only thing he could do now. Now it seemed that the Abbey Dean asked Long Qing to burn Yi Su to death, to help him become a sage, split Taoism, and secretly help the new stream. All of these pointed to weakening Sang Sang. It was obvious that he wanted to harm Sang Sang. According to the Academy's calculation, the Abbey Dean used the tomes of arcane to deal with Sang Sang. But why? It was not logical to not think about religious beliefs. Sang Sang was Haotian. Why did Taoism want to kill her? Why did they dare to kill her? What was the meaning? Sang Sang did not say, and Ning Ke did not ask. As long as he could return to his home in Chang'an, he would have a lot of time to solve this puzzle and make corresponding countermeasures. The big black horse was so fast that it turned into a black lightning in the wind and snow. The green dog ran in the deep snow and was buried by the snow from time to time. It looked like a blooming green lotus and was not slow at all. A few days later, Ning Ke and his entourage left the cold region and came to a coniferous forest. In the forest, he saw a lot of frozen deer meat and blood left by wild beasts. Looking at the footprints of the beasts and the broken trees, he was sure that this should be the place where the snow wolves had stayed. Sang Sang reached out her right index finger to the big black horse's neck. The big black horse understood and slowed down. She got off clumsily with her hands on her belly and waved. The green-haired dog ran over happily and jumped into her arms. The green dog ran to her happily and jumped into her arms. She held the green dog and looked to the south indifferently. To the dog in of the north of the mountain of the south. It was still snowing in the south, but Sang Sang watched for an hour, and then said, "Turn east 12-8. Ning Ke helped her get on the horse, and pulled the reins gently to change the direction of the big black horse. He did not ask any questions during the whole process, as if he knew what she meant. A few days later, Sang Sang stopped the big black horse again, when they arrived at an icy river. She looked to the sky in a certain direction with an indifferent expression, but her eyes were filled with irritation. Then she took out an abacus and began to dial. Ning Ke was surprised to see that she rarely used an abacus when she was building a house in Chang'an. She needed a solemn sense of ceremony to boost her confidence because of the large amount of money involved. There were few people and beasts in the snowfield. It was very quiet except for the whistling wind. But at this time, there was a crisp sound of cracking on the icy river. Song Song's fingers left a shadow on the abacus, as if she was playing the piano. After a while, she stopped working on the abacus. Ning Ke looked at her and saw that the wooden beads on the abacus were arranged in a very regular, but absolutely meaningless pattern. He could not understand it and asked directly, "How do we go?" "To the northwest 3323, Sang Sang said. Going to the northwest meant going back, but Ning Ke did not doubt it. He lifted the reins and let the big black horse go in that direction, kicking snow and splashing ice all the way without any delay. At dusk, the big black horse stopped again. Sang Sang took out the abacus and began to dial again like playing the piano. When she finished calculating, she gave a new direction and Ning Ke followed it. From the beginning to the end, he did not ask any questions, nor did he have any doubts. He just cooperated with her in silence, just like many years ago. He absolutely trusted her when it came to calculating the route. This situation repeated for the next few days. Finally, Sang Sang did not even put the abacus in her clothes. Instead, she put it in front of the saddle and fiddled with it from time to time. The number of times she changed directions became more and more frequent. She was much weaker than before. Although it was difficult for her to calculate everything in the world, she was still much better than ordinary people when it came to calculating. There was no pattern to the turning and retreating. In the end, even Ning Ke lost his direction. But he knew that they were getting closer and closer to Chang'an City. Sang Sang and the person he did not want to meet had not been seen yet. Ning Ke's expression became more and more solemn, because he knew that everything would get more dangerous in the end. More importantly, he found that Song Song's energy was getting weaker and weaker, and he did not know how long she could continue calculating. Sang Sang became very tired and sleepy. She often fell asleep on his chest while fiddling with the abacus. Fortunately, she was not as weak as she was when she was seriously ill, and she did not vomit blood. Every time Ning-Kei looked at her bulging belly, he could not help but wonder if she was going to give birth soon. For the next 2 days, they traveled southward along the Tianqi mountain. The snowy ridge drew a clear, beautiful and undulating line in the blue sky, guiding the big black horse in the right direction. Helan City loomed among the mountains. Sang Sang stopped the big black horse again. This time, the calculation took a long time. The wooden beads on the abacus kept bouncing. They were put back to their original positions by her fingers, and then they were plucked out again. It was very messy. Her movements also became a little messy, as if she was playing the piano at random. The indifference on her face was replaced by annoyance and finally anger. With a clap, her hand fell on the abacus, messing up the pattern that was about to take shape. She let her messy hair fly around her cheeks and said, "We will meet." Ning-Kei only kept silent for a short time, and then asked, "Is there a chance?" Sang Sang said, "No." He asked about the probability of defeating the Abbey Dean if they worked together. Sang Sang's answer was very simple and clear. This time, Ning-Kei kept silent for a long time, and then said, "Can we go around it?" Sang Sang said, "No." Ning-Kei did not doubt her judgment after hearing 2 consecutive rejections. So he dismounted without hesitation and led the reins to the mountains. He said, "Find a way to hide first." Hearing this, Sang Sang slightly raised her eyebrows a little unhappy. She was Haoyan. How could she hide because of a human? And that human used to be her dog. Of course, in fact, she had been hiding by the snow sea for a long time. She could keep her state of mind at that time, but it was very difficult now. She did not want to appear too weak in front of Ning-Kei, and needed his protection. When her hand fell on her abdomen subconsciously, she kept silent. Ning-Kei did not expect that she would still think about these things at this moment. He held the reins and quickly ran into the mountains. He came to a cold lake surrounded by cold trees and said, "Right here." From here, they could see Helan City from afar, but it was difficult to be discovered by the outside world. Sang Sang waved her sleeves sewn from animal skin. A clear light flashed, and an aura appeared and then disappeared. Ning-Kei did not find anything strange, but he knew that she had opened her own world. The flat land by the cold lake, himself, the big black horse, and the green-haired dog were all in this world. It did not take long for him to see the proof. The snow by the lake gradually melted, and the temperature gradually rose. Grass gradually sprouted in the mud. Suddenly, it snowed in Tianqi Mountain. Ning-Kei looked at the outside world and felt it was amazing. The wind and snow outside were furious, but here it was as warm as spring. He thought for a while, took out his iron cutlass, and neatly chopped some trees. With his inhuman strength, it only took him a very short time to build a wooden house by the lake. The wooden house was a little shabby, but the faint smell of wood could calm the mind. Sang Sang held her abdomen and quietly watched him work. Hide in the small building and become one. She looked at the shabby wooden house and said expressionlessly, "You know it is impossible to hide forever. Steal half a day of leisure in a fleeting life." Ning-Kei said, "Hide as long as you can. Well, don't recite poems anymore. I taught you these poems when you were young. What's more, you need to rest now." He helped her into the wooden house and let her lean on the soft bedding. He lowered his head against her bulging abdomen, trying to listen to the movement inside. But there was movement outside the wooden house. The Taoist in indigo appeared opposite the cold lake. His face was frosty, and his clothes were snowy. No one knew how long he had been searching in the world, and how many places. He looked at the other side of the cold lake quietly. He obviously saw nothing, but he did not leave. Ning-Kei raised his head and glanced at him. Then he lowered his head and continued to lean against Sang Sang's abdomen. He ignored what was happening outside and looked extremely focused. Sang Sang ignored him and looked at the other side of the cold lake. She suddenly said, "I really want to kill him." Ning-Kei was happy to hear the movement of the fetus. He replied, "You can't kill him now, so don't even think about it." Sang Sang said indifferently, "I can't kill him, so I want to kill him." Ning-Kei was startled and thought it was indeed true. If it were in the past, she could kill whoever she wanted. Why would she need to think about it? He sat up and held her in his arms. He looked at the Abbey Dean across the cold lake quietly, as if he was looking at a fake world in a mirror, or a play or a painting. It seemed absurd, interesting, and peaceful. In fact, the world he and Sang Sang were in now was fake. And this world could not be maintained forever. It would eventually break. The moment when Sang Sang could not maintain this world. It was probably the moment when they left this world. Chapter 1129. In fact, Ning Ke had only seen the Abbey Dean a few times in Chang'an. Now that he thought about it, every time they met, it seemed to be accompanied by wind and snow. It was extremely cold from the outside to the inside. In the past, the Abbey Dean's indigo robe was clean and free of snow and frost. He was like an immortal. But now, he was covered with dust and looked tired. He was just like an ordinary person. He had been searching for Sang Sang for many days and places. He had traveled thousands of miles with the distanceless state, but he was still one step behind. Ning Ke and Song Song's natal connection was stronger than the strongest in the world. He looked at the other side of the cold pond, and the withered grass under the snow. There was no expression on his face. His mind was calm because there was nothing there. But he always felt that there was something there. It was the same feeling he had when he passed by the desolate man's tribe in the snow sea in the past. So he did not leave. The mountain that was abandoned by Haotian became colder and colder in the wind and snow. The Abbey Dean stood by the pond quietly, and looked calmer and calmer, as if invisible water had flowed through him, and washed away all the dust. The weathered look on his face became lighter and lighter, until it finally disappeared. The snow on his indigo robe also melted and disappeared. A pure aura came out of his body and reached his feet. It melted the snow and greened the old grass. It spread to the pond and melted the ice, creating ripples. Spring was coming. The spring wind greened the shore of the cold pond, and reached the other side in an instant. Sang Sang looked at him quietly, and put her fingers on the ground. The aura of life flowed into the earth like a trickle. The spring outside, and the spring inside merged together. Without each other, there was no boundary, and they could not be seen. When the dusk came, the Abbey Dean left the pond, leaving a lingering aura of the space passage and disappeared. Ning Ke was relieved when he confirmed that the Abbey Dean did not find Sang Sang in him. But he did not look happy because it was only temporary. No one knew how long this situation would last. Can we go now? He looked at the magnificent Helan city in the distant mountains and asked. Sang Sang did not answer. Ning Ke understood what she meant. The Abbey Dean might have gone to the South Sea, or he might be looking at the earth from the top of the snow-capped peak. If she opened her world, he would easily find her. The abacus was on her knees, but she could not figure out the position of the Abbey Dean. She was becoming weaker and weaker. Or rather, she was becoming more and more like an ordinary woman. This fact made her silent, helpless, and even angrier. She grabbed Ning Ke's hand and bit it hard, like a mother beast who had been stimulated. Ning Ke looked at the blood flowing from the corner of her mouth. It was very painful, but he did not cry out. His eyes were full of love and sympathy. As night fell, the wind and snow in the mountains suddenly stopped. A gust of wind came from the sea in the southeast, blowing away the thick clouds in the sky. Hundreds of stars appeared in front of him, and at the same time, there was a full moon. Ning Ke held Sang Sang and leaned against the soft animal skin, staring at the stars and the bright moon in the night sky in a daze. Sang Sang said, "I want to have sex." Ning Ke was slightly stunned. He looked down at her calm face, and realized that she was not joking. Of course, if she was really joking, this matter would be a little too funny. He said, "What are you thinking about? Go to sleep first." Sang Sang said, "I want to sleep with you." Ning Ke was startled and asked, "Sleepy?" Sang Sang said, "I want to sleep with you." Her mood was very calm, even a little indifferent. She was not so serious but extremely serious. Ning Ke held her, smelled her scent and kissed her face. After a while, he suddenly said, "Can we not watch?" Sang Sang looked at a certain place without blinking her eyes and said, "Why?" Ning Ke said, "What is this? What people do, God is watching." Sang Sang looked up at him and said, That's interesting. Interesting. Nonsense. That's boring. Well, I say, even if you have to watch, can't you show some emotions? Ning Ke was not in a good mood when he woke up in the morning, because he always felt that Song Song's mood was a little strange, as if she was saying goodbye to him. They had just reunited, and she was going to run away again? He thought about it, and felt that something was wrong. His expression gradually became solemn, and he was extremely vigilant as he looked across the cold pond at the grassland that had just been in spring yesterday, and was frozen by the cold wind overnight. What happened next gave him another possible answer, but it did not make him feel a little relaxed. Instead, his mood became heavier, because Sang Sang seemed to be about to give birth. He had experience in many things, but he had no experience in this matter. Sang Sang used to be omniscient and omnipotent, but there was nothing she could do about this matter. It was quiet in the wooden hut. Sang Sang held her bulging abdomen and felt the movement coming from inside. Her thin brows were extremely tightly knitted, and her face was a little pale. The labor pain had not begun, but it was about to begin. Giving birth was troublesome, and what was more troublesome was that Song Song's state of mind was greatly disturbed, and it was difficult for her to maintain her own world. There was gossamer floating in the air outside the window, and Ning Ke knew that it was a crack. If the world was smaller, or the matter in the world was less, with Song Song's ability, she might be able to maintain it for a longer period of time. Ning Ke looked at the looming crack in the space outside the window, and understood why he felt that separation was close at hand when he woke up in the morning. After a moment of silence, he led the big black horse out of the wooden hut. There was no clear cracking sound, but only a gust of cold wind. He returned to the real world, and stood by the real cold pond. Looking back, there was no road or house. He decided to leave here, as far as possible from the cold pond, and as far as possible from her. He understood what Long Qing had said before the battle. It turned out that his search was not a good thing for her. However, just as he was about to leave, someone came. That person returned to the pond. Where is she? The Abbey Dean looked at him and asked calmly. He was neither anxious nor angry, as if everything was under his control, like the water grass in the water, the shadow of the pond in the middle of the pond, and the will of heaven in his chest. Ning Ke did not answer his question. He took out his iron cutlass and chopped across the cold pond. He chopped thousands of times. The blade broke through the air and turned into countless shadows. Each shadow was a stroke, and 2 strokes were a character. His iron cutlass instantly wrote thousands of characters by the cold pond. Thousands of characters. His face was as pale as paper, and the psyche power in his sense of perception was emptied. Countless fierce talisman intents covered the cold pond. Under the Abbey Dean's feet, a few green grass that was stretching its wastes were silently broken into countless pieces. The cold tree by the pond was silently broken into countless pieces. The world by the cold pond was a painting. Ning Ke cut the painting into countless pieces. The Abbey Dean was a man in the painting. How could he be at ease? This chapter is mainly about heaven is watching. A guy on Weibo said, when asking his girlfriend to make love, he always thinks of a saying, heaven is watching. WB Zach. When I saw it, I thought of Ning Ke and Sang Sang doing it. What was that? In the past, I've written about the battle between heaven and man, and the unification of heaven and man. But I've always wanted her to see it. The heavens are watching what man is doing. How cool. It was supposed to be a long and detailed description, but everyone knew about the recent situation. So I simplified it and kept the meaning. I couldn't help but feel a bit regretful. Many years ago, I wrote the part about Fan Xian and Zhang Daodu in the Qing dynasty with great care. I wanted to use other methods to write it again. What a pity. The last chapters must be written with great care. See you tomorrow. Chapter 1130. Something cropped up, and he had to go out. Updates could only appear very late at night, so he had to report to everyone in advance. Chapter 1131. If the grass and flowers in the mountain formed a complete painting, then the Abbey Dean was indeed in the painting. However, he was also outside the painting. To be more precise, there seemed to be a small painting in the painting, and he was in the small painting. The small painting was the interlayer of the aura of heaven and earth, a secondary space between the real space. He was standing there. He seemed to be very close, but he was actually very far away. He seemed to be inside the painting, but he was actually inside the painting. Within a few feet of the Abbey Dean, under the influence of the aura of heaven and earth gushing out from the interlayer, the feeling of spring was extremely strong. There were green buds on the trees and yellow flowers in the grass. Ninkei's thousands of iron cutlass strikes could cut the green buds and yellow flowers into pieces, but not the feeling of spring. The feeling of spring was invisible. The spring breeze blew, and the leaves swayed. The Abbey Dean's figure instantly moved to a distance of more than 100 feet behind the cold lake. He was far away from the terrifying talisman intent and blade intent, and could not enter for the time being. It was like a city wall. People outside could not enter, and people inside could not leave even if they wanted to. Both the city and the cold lake eventually became a prison cell. Ninkei had been imprisoned in Chang'an twice, so he was no stranger to this situation. You shouldn't have left Chang'an. The Abbey Dean looked at him and said. His expression was still calm and gentle, just like the spring breeze. He was like a teacher who knew everything in the world, and was sincerely giving advice. You have no chance of winning. Ninkei knew that the Abbey Dean was right. His most powerful weapon, or his biggest hope to defeat grand cultivators like the Abbey Dean and the drunkard, was the God-stunning array passed down to him by his teacher, Chang'an. Leaving Chang'an meant leaving this weapon thousands of miles away. In a sense, it was no different from suicide. But he had to leave Chang'an. He had made this decision on that snowy day, and he would never regret it, because he knew that the Abbey Dean would kill Sang Sang, and he was the only one who could find Sang Sang before the Abbey Dean did. Instead of thinking about the past, he only thought about what would happen in the future. He looked at the fierce talisman intent that covered the sky and earth around the cold lake, and thought about what he should do later. The moment the blade intent dissipated, he would leave as far as possible. The Abbey Dean could not see through her world, so she would be safe. Everything was to give Sang Sang a chance to escape, but it would probably ruin all his chances. He looked at the big black horse, thinking that it would die with him, and felt a little guilty. The big black horse did not look at him. He did not want to see his apologetic eyes. He did not play cute, silly, or naive. He just stared at the Abbey Dean on the other side of the cold pond. His eyes were extremely sharp, like a warrior before a battle. Ninkei was touched. He stroked the mane on its neck and smiled. Suddenly, his smile disappeared and his expression changed. He heard a crisp sound coming from behind him. A brand new wooden house appeared beside the cold pond. Sang Sang slowly walked out of the house with her hands on her waist. She had returned to the human world. She had dispersed her own world. Why did you come out? Ninkei asked angrily. I don't feel well. Sang Sang strolled by the pond with her big belly. She didn't even look at the Abbey Dean on the other side of the pond and said expressionlessly, It's your fault. Where do you feel uncomfortable? What does it have to do with me again? It's all your fault. Of course it's your problem. Ninkei was speechless. Wasn't it what she wanted? Of course. There was nothing to argue about at this moment. As for the reason why she came out, how could he not know? He was not going to ask further, because the answer was a little mushy. Sang Sang said, I don't want you to leave. I want to be with you. I'm used to being with you. Being used to it was really a beautiful thing. Holding her hand, Ninkei sat down on an old tree stump by the pool. Looking at her tired eyes, which shone with a certain luster of life, he felt unprecedentedly satisfied. Hearing her words, the outcome of the match and many other things were no longer that important. After Sang Sang came to the pond, the Abbey Dean was silent for a long time. Then he bowed to her from a distance. He was still polite and even a little pious, as if he was still her follower. Ninkei sat under the tree stump and meditated, hoping to recover the psyche power that had been consumed by thousands of talismans as soon as possible. Looking at the Abbey Dean's behavior, he frowned slightly and was even more confused. Why? Why did the Abbey Dean want to kill Sang Sang? Helping Yi Su become a sage, starting a prairie fire of the new stream, splitting Taoism, destroying the foundation of Hao Yan's faith, weakening her, and paying such a painful price just to kill her? Where was the reason? Where was the justice? This was the question of the Academy and the whole world. Taoism and the Academy are the same. It's not because the headmaster of the Academy used to study in Taoism, but because we both think from the perspective of human beings. The Abbey Dean stood by the pond, and there was a green leaf between his fingers. It looked like a tiny flute. Even though we are the same, our final destination is different. The headmaster of the Academy wants to break the sky, but I don't. Ning Ke did not express his opinion on this question, because he had tried it before and knew that it was almost impossible to change one's outlook on life. What do you want to do? This was his biggest concern. The Abbey Dean looked at Sang Sang by the pond quietly for a long time. Then he showed an inexplicable smile and said slowly, I want to change the sky. He dared to change the sky. What was the sky? It was not the sky. It was Hao Yan, the only and supreme God worshipped by human beings. It was the guardian and dominator of the world, and the faith of Taoism. The Abbey Dean wanted to change the sky. He wanted to change Hao Yan. Sang Sang looked at him quietly and asked, why? This was Hao Yan's problem. The Abbey Dean said calmly, because you can no longer fulfill your duty as Hao Yan. Sang Sang raised her eyebrows slightly and said emotionlessly, stupid. According to the doctrine of the West Hill, it was more than stupid for mortals or believers to judge Hao Yan. It was the most unforgivable blasphemy. However, the Abbey Dean did not accept this. You have already lost. The Abbey Dean looked at her quietly. His eyes were soft and even slightly pitiful. Many years ago, you wanted to set the trap for the headmaster of the Academy. You woke up from the divine kingdom and projected your consciousness into the human world. From that moment on, you have lost. Sang Sang slightly squinted her eyes. Ning Ke felt a little uneasy and held her hand tighter. Did you really set the trap to kill the headmaster of the Academy? Could it be that heaven's will is unpredictable, and you can't think of any other way? You don't need to come to the human world. No. Maybe you didn't realize that you set the trap out of curiosity. You wanted to see what the human world was like. The Abbey Dean looked at her and pitifully said, when you started to be curious, you were no longer Hao Yan. You began to have the characteristics of human beings. You can no longer return to the divine kingdom. That is the proof. Sang Sang said expressionlessly, so? Then? The Abbey Dean said calmly, Taoism woke you up in the chaos to protect the human world. When you can no longer bear the responsibility, Taoism naturally has the responsibility to replace you. So, I will do everything I can to kill you. Then I will choose a new Hao Yan. Dirty words. I still wrote it. Chapter 1132. You see, reason is always the simplest thing in the world. Water flows downwards, clouds rise to the sky. Where there is light, there is darkness. When it's time to change, it's time to change. The Abbey Dean looked at Ning Ke and explained calmly. Ning Ke was silent for a while and said, why didn't you think so before? After all, Hao Yan Taoism is Hao Yan Taoism. Just like the soul is human soul, who would want to kill themselves to exchange for a new soul when they are living a peaceful life. The Abbey Dean rubbed the green leaf gently with his fingers. A fresh and sweet voice accompanied his words. It was as fragrant as the wildflowers around them. I can think it through, or dare to think about it, thanks to Yi Su, my great disciple. He found a new way in the shabby alley of Linkhong City, and founded the new stream. He wrote those thought-provoking words, and taught me to think in this way. In a sense, he is my teacher. The Abbey Dean's eyes fell on Sang Sang, and he said the following important words. The doctrines of the new stream and Hao Yan Taoism do not actually conflict with each other. They are just truths from different times. For countless years, Human beings have been in a desolate period and needed your protection. However, human beings are still growing. 1,000 years ago, there was the headmaster of academy, the great divine priest of light, who founded the Enlightenment doctrine, Kaharan, Lotus, and me. All these things prove that human beings have grown to a level that we could never imagine at the beginning. Human beings have grown up and no longer need your protection. They are strong enough to protect themselves. They don't need to die and come back to life like weeds. They don't need to endure the pain of endless reincarnation between the everlasting night and the daytime. The cold pond was still cold, but the lakeside was as warm as spring. Flowers were blooming and green trees were swaying. The scene that was cut into pieces by Ning Kei's blade was gradually restored by spring. It was silent for a long time. Only the pleasant sound of the leaf flute between the Abbey Dean's fingers could be heard. It was not the signal of retreat on the battlefield, but more like the beating of war drums. Ning Kei took a long time to digest the shock in his heart. He looked at the Abbey Dean on the other side of the river and said, "The headmaster said something similar. Human beings have indeed grown to the point where they don't need Haotian anymore. They have long stood up, and some can even fly freely. The difference is that the Academy thinks that human beings need to go to a wider world, while Haotian Taoism still thinks that they should stay where they are." The Abbey Dean said, "As I said many years ago, this is a difference of ideas that cannot be solved. I think eternity comes from the beauty of calmness and solemnity, but the headmaster and his disciples always think that change is eternity." Ning Kei said, "Changes are the norm. Unchanging is an anomaly that happens occasionally." The Abbey Dean said, "Mankind is a product of abnormality. Why should we pursue normality?" Ning Kei said, "If Yi Su were still alive, or eldest brother were here, they could debate with you. But I can't. I'm best at fighting and killing, not theory. But even I can see the biggest problem in your theory." The Abbey Dean said, "Please say it." Ning Kei said, "If it is still a self-enclosed system that wants to be isolated from the outside world, then even without Haotian, we still need a collective will to carry out the rules. Who will do it?" After a moment of silence, the Abbey Dean's voice sounded calmly. "I will do it." The Abbey Dean said, "You see, this matter can still be solved very easily." "I will do it." "What for?" "Be Haotian. Look, there is a gray machine in the sky. The weather is changing, it's thundering, it's raining, put away the clothes." In an instant, these words flashed through Ning Kei's mind. He lowered his head in silence and looked at the sky reflected by the gradually melting pond water. He gradually calmed down and began to think about this matter. The more he thought about it, the more he felt it was amazing. The Abbey Dean was really amazing. Kill Haotian and become the new Haotian. This was not what a man should do, but someone else could replace him. This was an unimaginable ambition, and also the most valiant spiritual declaration. Anything, as long as it was large enough, would give people a sense of greatness, such as the snow-capped peak or the wilderness. As long as the ambition was big enough, it was also a kind of greatness. In the end, the Abbey Dean still followed the headmaster and the youngest uncle. But he never doubted his own past, because Taoism's countless years of accumulation and foundation gave him enough ideas to directly draw a conclusion. If Haotian couldn't do it, then he would change it. He would do it himself. What a great ambition! What a great courage! Sang Sang looked at the other side of the river expressionlessly. Other than Ning Kei, the Abbey Dean was the person closest to Haotian in the whole world. Neither Wei Guangming nor the old revelation of heaven could be compared to him. He had comprehended the revelation of heaven and had waited for many years in the South Sea. He had communicated with her many times, so he naturally knew what she was trying to say. "You are a statue erected by Taoism. It's just changing a statue. Why do you need to be brave for a while?" The Abbey Dean looked at her and said, he was no longer as compassionate as before, but calm and natural as an elder. Then he looked at Ning Kei and said, "Neither the Academy nor Taoism wants Haotian. At least before the last part of the journey, we can walk the same path. Or can you really convince yourself that the headmaster is wrong?" Ning Kei was silent for a long time and then said, "No, the headmaster is not wrong. In fact, you are not wrong either. Mankind does not need a Hautyin anymore. Sang Sang was expressionless, as if she heard nothing. He held her hand and looked at the Abbey Dean and continued, I don't want Hautyin either. But the problem is, I want a wife. He did not care about the survival of Hautyin, but he must care about his wife. If the old Hautyin died, he could replace him with a new one. But if his wife was gone, could he replace her with a new one? Even if he could know, there was no even if. He just could not. I can't live without a wife. Ning Ke told the Abbey Dean, and the whole world. The Abbey Dean felt a little regretful, but he was not affected. He had been looking for Hautyin for many days. His Taoist heart was already as firm as a rock, unshakable even in the storm and raging river. It was as unstoppable as the wildflowers blooming all over the mountain. The headmaster will be very disappointed in you. Now that I think about it, he should have been disappointed in you by the Sisui River. No matter whether it is to break or change the sky, it is ultimately a matter for mankind, and can only be decided by us. But you are on her side. Do you really think of yourself as a human being? The Abbey Dean moved his fingers, and the green leaf floated down to the front of his shoes. It was cut into pieces by the remaining blade style. Ning Ke's expression changed slightly. He remembered clearly what the headmaster said before he left the Sisui River. At that time, he could solve the problem of Hautyin. He could still solve it now. It is a matter of three views. He looked at the Abbey Dean and said, Our views on life and the world are different. The biggest difference is our views on love. I will not let her die. Even if the headmaster wants me to kill her, I won't, let alone you. I really care about what will happen to the world, but I care more about what will happen to her. The Abbey Dean said, Your love for the world is great love, and your love for her is small love. Ning Ke was silent for a while and said, But it is all love, isn't it? He said no more, took down the iron bow, took out the iron arrows, and began to prepare in silence. The talisman by the cold pool gradually dissipated. The Abbey Dean was about to enter the painting. The conversation would end, and the battle would begin. The talisman that filled the world around the cold pool was gradually assimilated by heaven and earth. The fierce blade style was no longer there, and the broken painting was gradually repaired. The Abbey Dean walked out from the deepest part of the painting and into the real world. Sang Sang stood up slowly and looked at him expressionlessly with her hands behind her back. The Abbey Dean sighed and said, Look, how beautiful it would be if it could remain calm and unchanging. Countless flowers bloomed in the mountains, countless green vines grew, and countless green trees swayed. In an instant, the atmosphere of spring was so dense that it was hard to breathe. Ning Ke felt like he was bathing in the spring breeze, but he also felt like he was drowning. Sang Sang still held her hands behind her back and looked indifferent, but her eyes were slightly narrowed. The infinite sea of flowers was boundless spring. Every flower, and every wisp of spring was the most powerful killing intent. Ning Ke raised the iron bow and pointed the cold and dark arrowhead at the Abbey Dean on the other side. The Abbey Dean looked at him calmly and held his hands behind his back, just like Sang Sang. He was not vigilant at all, because he was just at the threshold and could turn around and leave at any time. No matter how powerful the primordial 13 arrows were, they could not hit him. Those doors were the gaps in the interlayer of the chi of heaven and earth. They were the blooming flowers in the mountains. Every flower was a gap and a door. It was impossible to determine which door the Abbey Dean would enter from. Ning Ke looked at the other side and felt the bowstring trembling slightly at the corner of his mouth. Beads of sweat dripped down, but he did not feel it. Song Song's hand fell on his shoulder. A warm or even hot power entered his body and instantly replenished the psyche power that he had used to write talismans. He was at his peak state. 198900309. Sang Sang looked indifferent. She said 2 numbers, just like how she pointed the way in the wind and snow a few days ago, by the lake in winter a few years ago, and even earlier in Min Mountain. But her voice was no longer as childish as it was when she was young. And this time, the 2 numbers she said were longer and more complicated. Naturally, it meant that she was more precise. Ning Ke did not hesitate. To be more precise, he did not even think. Just like before, he pointed at a place on the other side of the lake, and released the bowstring, as if it was an instinct. The iron arrow pierced through the air and flew away silently. Strangely enough, he was aiming at a falling tree, far away from the Abbey Dean's position. But the Abbey Dean's expression became extremely solemn. The Abbey Dean's figure disappeared between heaven and earth. He completely disappeared. This was the distanceless state. He entered the interlayer of the chi of heaven and earth. It was also quiet, because he did not leave any trace, not even the wind. It was not until then that the buzzing sound of the iron arrow spread around the lake. A clear arrow path appeared in the sky above the cold pond. The condensed clouds slowly flowed. The iron arrow went somewhere. The big tree was still falling slowly unaffected. There was no trace on the cliff further away, just like the Abbey Dean. The arrow seemed to have shot into nothingness. The next moment, on a snow-capped peak more than 10 miles away, the Abbey Dean's figure appeared, floating in the air in front of the cliff. The iron arrow, like a dragonfly resting on a dewdrop, rested softly on his left shoulder. The sharp arrowhead slightly sank into his indigo robe. It did not penetrate deep, but a drop of dark red blood oozed out. Blood was also dirt. Being stained with dirt, one would not be able to maintain tranquility. The Abbey Dean frowned slightly. He did not expect the iron arrow to be so powerful. It could shoot through the chi of heaven and earth, into the interlayer of nothingness, and chase the powerhouse of the distanceless state. Ning Kei's primordial 13 arrows had exceeded his original state. Look, you've said a lot of things that make sense, but you've forgotten one thing. If you want your wife to treat you well, you must first have a wife. If you want to change the world, you must first surpass us. Looking at the snow-capped peak, Ning Kei drew his bow again and said to the Abbey Dean. At the same time, he was talking to Sang Sang. 3 things to report. First, it was certainly a crazy thing to make love at that time. But considering that the young couple were not ordinary people, and they were extremely selfish to each other, I did not care. I am willing to sacrifice all reasonableness for the sake of people, and God is watching. Second, our good friend and old friend, Fong Xiang's new book, The Invincible God of War, can finally be seen at the starting point. Let's go flirt with him. Although he is married and has a child, he is still a cute little boy. Third, tomorrow at midnight. Chapter 1133. Sang Sang was not the same as before. With the rise of the new stream, and the decline of Haotian Taoism, she became weaker and weaker after losing the power of faith from hundreds of millions of believers. Especially now, she had a child in her belly. She was no longer the omnipotent Haotian. She no longer possessed a powerful state that was beyond the reach of ordinary people. However, the arrow she helped Ning Kei shoot was stronger than the iron arrow Ning Kei shot at Qinghe Prefecture during the Right to Light. Why? Because during the Right to Light, Ning Kei used the natal connection between them to forcefully seize the hierarch Xiong Chimo's Tianqi and take all of her power into his arms. But this time, it was her own will. This was the real oneness of heaven and man. Who could defeat her? Ning Kei stood beside her and drew his bow again. He aimed at the other side of the lake, and anywhere within hundreds of miles. As long as he heard her voice, he would release the bowstring. The wildflowers on the mountain were blown up by the wind. They floated to the sky and then fell down slowly. It looked like a fairy hiding in the clouds, waiting for Haotian to show her miracles in the human world. But Song Song's face was a bit pale. She frowned and squinted her willow-like eyes. She seemed a bit angry and unhappy. It had nothing to do with her failure to shoot the Abbey Dean to death. She was unhappy because of her physical condition. She could not bear to be so weak that she had to fight with humans like this. She could not even win. Yes, she had tried her best to help Ning Kei shoot the arrow. The heavens calculation was activated in an instant and consumed a lot of energy. Now she was trying to figure out the Abbey Dean's position again. She felt uncomfortable, and her lower abdomen was aching. This was a battle of the highest level. Since the beginning of human history, only the headmaster of the academy entered the divine kingdom, and the 100-day reign caused by Haotian was more powerful. So it only took a moment for the winner to be determined. Sang did not figure out the Abbey Dean's position immediately. Ning-Ke could not release the bowstring immediately. The Abbey Dean did not miss the opportunity. He returned to the side of the lake as the mountain wind blew. The lake was cold and full of spring. He stood in the spring and looked at Ning-Ke and Sang without any expression. His eyes were firm and calm, even a bit proud. He returned to the side of the lake. He was not alone, for he brought a mountain with him. Stretching for thousands of miles, the Min Mountain divided the northern continent into two. The Min Mountain in the north of Helan City was often called the Tianqi Mountain. Because this was the territory of the Devil's Doctrine, it was the mountain range abandoned by Haotian. The Abbey Dean was the master of Haotian Taoism. Logically speaking, he should not be connected with the aura of this towering mountain range, and even contradicted it. But now it was different. Just like the great divine priest of light, who founded the Enlightenment doctrine 1,000 years ago, he had betrayed Haotian. More precisely, he had abandoned Haotian. He of Haotian Mountain, and he of that he had become one. He went back to the lakeside and placed his right hand on the other side of the lake. He used the state of pureness to merge with heaven and earth, and immeasurable to lift heaven and earth. His fingers contained the aura of heaven and earth of Tianqi Mountain, and directly smashed it toward Ning-Ke and Sang. He'd relied on an unimaginably profound Tao technique before he attacked. And his attacks were so simple and direct, so unreasonable. Because there was utterly no need for any reasoning when it was boundlessly powerful. Around the cold pond, all the spring in the mountains and fields were crushed into pieces. The flowers and wild branches that were cut into pieces by Ning-Ke's blade were crushed even more miserably, until they became pieces that couldn't be cut. An entire mountain range that was thousands of miles long broke through the sky and fell. Ning-Ke knew that even if the iron arrow could pierce through the mountain, it would not be able to stop the mountain from falling. He withdrew the bow without hesitation, and turned around to hold Sang in his arms. He was ready to use his own body to resist. He wanted to see if his body, which had been refined by the Great Spirit for many years and strengthened by Sang for 1,000 years, could withstand the mountain and the disaster brought by the Abbey Dean. Sang didn't give him the chance. Her hand passed under Ning-Ke's armpit, as if to give him a warm hug. The next moment, a black flower bloomed in her hand. It was a shabby black umbrella. The black umbrella that had disappeared for a very long time appeared in her hands just like that. Accompanied by a loud sound, she opened it and faced the descending mountain range. The black umbrella was as shabby as before, and its surface was covered with dust and grease. The surface of the umbrella, which had been exposed by the light of Buddha, had returned to its original appearance. Ning-Ke and Sang were used to calling the black umbrella the Big Black Umbrella, just like how they used to call the black horse the Big Black Horse. Because the black umbrella was indeed huge. Even though it looked small when it was opened, it was actually big enough to cover the entire sky. As long as it could cover the eyes, it could cover the sky. The big black horse and the indigo lion dog hid behind Sang and under the black umbrella in fear. Sang held the black umbrella and held Ning-Ke in her arms. She leaned on his shoulder and tilted her head, looking at the falling mountain. The Abbey Dean's hand crossed the cold lake and came to the other side. The entire Tianqi Mountains broke through the blue sky and crushed above the cold lake. Under the huge mountain, the big black umbrella looked like an inconspicuous black spot. Loud rumbling sounds resounded continuously. Countless smoke and dust sprayed into the sky and the wilderness. Countless gravel, like thousands of arrows, cut countless traces in the sky. The whole world began to shake. The ground shook violently. The pine trees in the distant mountains were shaken into the air. The blue ice lakes under the snow-capped peaks were also shaken into the sky. It was a magical scene. Like countless dark blue pearls, they left the ground and fell into the sky. The earthquake spread far away. Not to mention Chengjing of the Yan Kingdom. Even the crabs on the weird-shaped breakwater rocks in the famous embankment of the Song Kingdom felt the terrible shaking in the far north and jumped back into the sea in panic. Helan City was only a dozen or so miles away from here, so it was affected even more directly and violently. Countless cracks appeared on the two cliffs, and rocks fell and collapsed everywhere like a waterfall. The sound was very soul-stirring. The two heavy and tall city gates, which had blocked the grassland barbarians for countless years, were now seriously deformed and twisted, revealing a huge gap. The military fortress that had never fallen for hundreds of years was destroyed in front of their eyes. All kinds of terrible sounds, the magical and unreproducible scenery, the gradual collapse of the cliffs, and the destruction of the fortress all showed how terrifying the Abbey Dean's hand was. After a long time, the earthquake finally calmed down. The smoke and dust gradually fell, and was absorbed by the remaining ice and snow between the broken cliffs. The air gradually became clean again. The green trees in the mountains had already been crushed into fine powder, and the cold lake had been flattened. The remaining ice shards and the scaleless fish at the bottom of the lake had all fused with the soil and rocks. They could only wait for countless years before they were discovered. There was only a vague shape of the cold lake left. There was a mark on the bank of the lake, which was formed by the crushed stone powder. It circled a stone platform about 1,000 feet in radius. The spring had long become a monotonous world made of stones. The Abbey Dean stood on the other side of the stone mark on the bank of the lake. His face was slightly pale, and his right hand was slightly trembling. So did his indigo clothes, which were as soft and calm as water. Even he had to pay a great price for such an earth-shattering attack, with the entire Tianqi mountain. The cold pond had disappeared, and so had the feeling of spring. However, his state of mind was still as calm as the pond, and as warm as the feeling of spring. This was because he knew very well that this attack that he had planned for a long time must have seriously injured her. I only need to hold you back for 7 days, or even less. Eldest brother looked at the Abbey Dean and said calmly, "As for the final outcome, I don't care." The Abbey Dean asked, "Why?" Eldest brother said, "Youngest brother will return to Chang'an in 7 days. Ning Ke and Sang Sang would return to Chang'an. No matter what would happen next, at least one thing could be deduced. With the help of the God-stunning array, the Abbey Dean would not be the first in the world." After a moment of silence, the Abbey Dean suddenly looked up to somewhere in the sky. That was the southeast. Then he said something. It was a very inexplicable sentence. "If I become Haotian, you will never die in the divine kingdom." Deep in the sky, somewhere hidden by the clouds in the mountains, or in a small town, somewhere that Haotian could not see, a clear whistle suddenly sounded. The clear whistle was long and bright, echoing in the sky of the human world. It seemed to be extremely joyful. Hearing the clear whistle from afar, eldest brother's expression changed slightly and became a bit solemn. The Abbey Dean looked at him and said calmly, "Those who have achieved Taoism will have many helpers. How can you and the academy not be defeated?" Eldest brother sighed and said, "What does it have to do with Taoism?" Many people heard the clear whistle. The Tang army in Helan City had woken up from the terrible earthquake and were putting out fires everywhere. The scene was a bit chaotic, but the clear whistle made their movements a bit stiff. This was because they could sense the joy and decisiveness contained within this clear roar. When joy reached the extreme, it would become madness. Decisiveness. It was a decisiveness towards any life other than oneself. It was extreme selfishness. Ning Ke also heard the clear whistle. His face became a bit pale. Looking at Sang Sang, who had just opened her eyes, he lowered his head and kissed her on the forehead. He whispered, "You go first. I will be back soon." Sang Sang looked at him quietly. No one knew whether it was because she was too injured to speak, or because she did not want to. Ning Ke lowered his head, and did not want to make eye contact with her. He untied the belt between them and jumped up. The big black horse knew what he meant, and continued to run toward Helan City like a real arrow. Ning Ke jumped off the horse and ran backward as soon as his feet landed on the ground. His feet left deep footprints on the hard rocks. The hard leather boots quickly turned into soft and broken cotton, and were blown away by the wind. He was like a stone that was thrown by a catapult, and was thrown toward the wilderness where he had been. The sound of his body rubbing against the air was heard. His speed was unimaginably fast. But it was still too slow. When he ran back to the cliff, he saw a shocking scene. The Abbey Dean and eldest brother were facing each other in the sea of flowers. A green tree broke through the air and pressed toward eldest brother. Eldest brother used the cudgel as a sword and moved heaven and earth to meet it. It was the most tense moment. They were entangled and could not leave. But a third person appeared at this time. There was no flower fragrance in the sea of flowers, but there was a strong smell of alcohol that made people drunk. A blue-robed scholar appeared behind the eldest senior brother. He held a flagon in his left hand. He pulled out a sword from the flagon with his right hand. He stabbed the sword at eldest brother's chest. If the Abbey Dean was the first in the world, and eldest brother was the second, then he was probably the third. He was the real third person, facing the joint attack of the Abbey Dean and him. Especially such an insidious sneak attack. Eldest brother could not avoid it. Blood spurted and fell into the sea of flowers, dyeing the yellow wildflowers red. That was what Ning Ke saw. His face became even paler. He wanted to curse, but he did not. He only cursed silently in his heart. He was silent like a real stone. He hid the sound of rubbing against the air, and did not look at the blood flowing on eldest brother's back. His eyes were as cold as ice. He stepped on the delicate petals with his bare feet, but they did not break. He came to the back of the scholar in indigo. He did not pull out the iron cutlass because it would be perceived. He also did not use the iron arrow, because that person was with eldest brother. What he wanted to do was to sneak attack. The scholar in indigo's expression suddenly changed. After all, he was a grand cultivator who had experienced countless things in the world, and had an extremely high state. No matter how fast and unexpected Ning Ke came, it still touched his state of mind. The scholar in indigo felt the danger. His face became very pale. He pulled out his sword and was ready to leave. He was one of the two people who had lived the longest in the world. So he was also one of the two people who were most afraid of death. Not to mention that the person who sneaked up on him could not kill him. He just wanted to leave when he thought of the danger. Eldest brother did not let him go. That was the tacit understanding between the disciples of the academy. He knew that Ning Ke was back, so he had to do something. Eldest brother turned sideways and left the drunkard's sword in the flagon. He raised the cudgel with his right hand and faced the Abbey Dean's immeasurable attack. His left hand moved from the edge of his cotton jacket and pointed at the drunkard's eyebrows. The natural stream magical finger. That was Chun Pippi's fighting skill. The scholar in indigo let out a strange cry, covered his face and retreated. That retreat was very clever. He avoided the natural stream magical finger, and more importantly, sent himself into Ning Ke's arms first. There was a big difference between being active and being passive. That retreat could at least weaken Ning Ke's killing power by 30%. Ning Ke looked at the bent sword in the eldest brother's body and imagined the pain. He could no longer suppress his anger. He hit the back of the scholar in indigo like a stone. He hugged the indigo-clothed scholar and jumped into the sky. Then, he fiercely smashed into the cliff. The cliff was getting closer and closer, just in front of them. It seemed that they were going to die together. Ning Ke could not care less. His eyes were already red. They were dyed red by the blood from the eldest brother's back. His eyes were red from killing. He roared at the ear of the scholar in indigo. Drunkard! Aleph asterisk CKU. I'm going to take a shower, and then write the third chapter. It will be later. Chapter 1135. When the eldest brother came, Ning Ke left without hesitation, because he wanted to take the seriously injured Sang Sang away. At this time, he came back without hesitation, although he often called himself a villain. That was because he knew that the eldest brother was about to face a desperate situation. Under such circumstances, he had to go back. Otherwise, even if he returned to Chang'an and won the war, he would not be able to look at the human world with peace of mind if the eldest brother was not there. However, he did not expect that he would come back too late. He did not hear what the Abbey Dean said, so he did not know what it meant to the drunkard. He also did not expect that a grand cultivator like the drunkard would be so shameless and sneakily attack the eldest brother. Seeing the eldest brother bleeding, and the remaining sword in the flagon in his body, he seemed to feel the pain and anger. His eyes were red, and he could not care less about the cliff in front of him. He held the drunkard and threw himself to the cliff like a stone. The drunkard's face was pale. As a grand cultivator of the distanceless state, what he hated the most was to be approached by a powerhouse at the peak state of martial arts, or a powerhouse from the diabolism like Ning Ke and Yu Lian. At this time, he was locked by Ning Ke's sneak attack. How could he avoid the cliff that was coming at him? At the last moment of life and death, the grand cultivator, who had experienced the everlasting night, and had the most experience or wisdom in surviving, burst out a rare energy. A loud roar burst out from his lips. The chi of heaven and earth in the Tianqi Mountains, which was already extremely thin, was summoned by his vast psyche power, and was layered in the air in front of him. Every layer of the chi of heaven and earth was thin, thinner than paper. But when countless layers of chi of heaven and earth were stacked together, it was like countless pieces of paper stacked together. It not only had thickness, but also could resist force. In such a short time, the drunkard summoned and reconstructed hundreds of layers of the chi of heaven and earth. It seemed simple, but it actually showed his unimaginably powerful state. An invisible swamp suddenly appeared in front of the hard cliff. Ning Ke held the drunkard and threw himself into the swamp like a burning stone. A loud sound rang out between the cliffs. Because the impact wasn't very crisp, it wasn't a boom, but a buzzing sound. It sounded like a heavy hammer hitting a thick piece of paper. If it was such a thick stone, it would have been smashed by the hammer. However, if countless pieces of paper were stacked together, they would not be able to shatter them. The drunkard groaned. Blood flowed from the corner of his mouth and wetted his 3 strands of beard. Ning Ke groaned, and his face turned extremely pale. His ribs, which had been injured by Long Qing at the Yaozi Sea in the Yin territory, were broken again. The clothes on his chest were stained with blood. Neither of them died. A spiderweb-like crack appeared on the cliff, and the two of them were in the middle of the web. Ning Ke stepped on the cliff with one foot, creating more cracks. With the help of the huge recoil, he brought the drunkard's body down to the hard ground of the cliff again. The speed of the fall was extremely fast. At the same time, he strangled the drunkard's throat with both of his arms, and suddenly exerted his strength. His forehead hit the back of the drunkard's head, and his right knee rose up sinisterly, attacking the drunkard's perineum. He was best at close combat. He had killed Ada and Hengmu, and even killed Long Qing by the angry river. He had always relied on his body. Except for Yi Hongyu, no one could be his opponent. The problem was, in terms of cultivation state, he was much weaker than the drunkard. If it was a normal fight, he could not even get close to the drunkard, let alone attack. At this moment, with the help of the sneak attack and the natural stream magical finger of the eldest brother, he was able to get close to the drunkard. Of course, he would cherish this opportunity. Of course, he would try his best to cherish it. The distance of thousands of feet from the ground was enough for him to strangle the drunkard with his iron-like arms. Even if he could not, he would use his fists to smash the drunkard to death. The drunkard screamed, and the flagon in his left hand suddenly enlarged, blocking Ning Ke's arm that was strangling his throat. He took out a sword from the flagon with his right hand and stabbed at Ning Ke with all kinds of unimaginable strength. Because of the flagon, Ning Ke's arms could not strangle the drunkard's throat. The flagon represented the state of immeasurable. At the same time, he found that his attack could not touch the drunkard's body. It was all because of that damned sword. Before today, few people knew that the drunkard's real natal item was not the flagon, but the sword in the flagon. Today, He finally used his sword and seriously injured the eldest brother with his first move. It was obvious how powerful he was. The sword light was flashing among the cliffs. It did not have the intention to cross, but it was extremely sharp and weird. The sharp sword style passed through the drunkard's armpits, and even between his legs, stabbing at Ning Kei's foot, that was attacking the drunkard's genitals was blocked by the sword. But his forehead was about to hit the back of the drunkard's head. At this moment, the drunkard's sword arrived in a strange way. The drunkard held his sword horizontally, as if he was committing suicide. But the tip of the sword skimmed over his neck and stabbed between Ning Kei's eyebrows. Facing such a sword, anyone would want to avoid it. Even if it was instinctive, one would want to avoid it when seeing the approaching sword shadow. But Ning Kei did not, because his eyes were red, and he could not see anything. It was as if he did not see the drunkard's sword and fiercely smashed down. With a crisp sound, the sword broke. Ning Kei's eyebrows were pierced by the sword, and blood oozed out. This time his eyes were really red. Although he was blocked by the sword, he still managed to hit the drunkard. Although the remaining power could not directly smash the drunkard's head. The drunkard roared in anger, unable to hide his pain. The roar stopped abruptly, because they had landed on the ground. With a strange bang, the cliff rocks flew everywhere, and smoke and dust filled the air. Ning Kei's body was shaken off. The smoke and dust gradually settled, and the scene gradually became clear. The drunkard was holding the flagon in his left hand, and half of it was stuck in the hard cliff rocks. His body was covered with blood, especially the back of his head, which kept flowing. Ning Kei's face and the front of his body were also covered with blood. Both of them looked extremely miserable. The drunkard looked at him with blood dripping from the corner of his mouth. His eyes were extremely cold and horrifying, and he did not look like a human. "How dare you to sneak attack me?" His voice was extremely cold, as if he was not a human, because he was extremely angry at this moment. He had never thought that he would be forced into such a miserable situation by a junior, who could not surpass the 5 states. What made him even angrier was that he was almost killed by his opponent. All of this, he thought it was because Ning Kei sneak attacked him. Otherwise why? Ning Kei had never seen such a shameless person. Although he had always called himself the shame of the academy, he also felt that the drunkard was too shameless. Sneak attack. Didn't you sneak attack my senior brother before? How dare you sneak attack me? Listening to the drunkard's arrogant, cold, angry, and narcissistic questioning, Ning Kei's voice was emotionless. He replied, "I still dare to *CK your mother, so what? So what?" There was nothing he could do. Ning Kei's current state was still far away from the top cultivators in the world. It was difficult for him to defeat a grand cultivator, like the drunkard, when he was not in Chang'an. However, Ning Kei had a special advantage. Because he had joined the devil to cultivate the Great Spirit, and because he and Sang Sang had been cultivating together in the Buddha's chessboard for thousands of years, his body was extraordinarily strong. From his toes to his internal organs, it was difficult to be fatally injured. When he saw Sang Sang leaving from the top of the city wall of Chang'an, it was difficult for him to crush his own heart, not to mention being hurt by the enemy. He had not cultivated to the legendary immortality of the devil's doctrine, but now he was like a copper pea that could not be steamed, boiled, hammered, or fried. You could defeat him, but it was difficult to kill him. Therefore, he was like a piece of sticky candy that could not be shaken off, torn off, and entangled until the seas ran dry and the rocks melted. In order to kill him, Long Qing had prepared countless methods, but in the end, he only managed to kill him until he lost a lot of blood. Although the drunkard had shown his weird swordsmanship skills today, it was not easy to kill Ning Quebec. If he really tried, it would be what Ning Kei wanted to see. At this moment, there were 4 people on the cliff. The Abbey Dean, the eldest brother, the drunkard, and Ning Quebec Sang Sang had already entered Helan City. Although no one knew why she had to enter Helan City, it was obvious that she was confident that once she entered Helan City, she could get rid of the Abbey Dean and the drunkard, and successfully return to Chang'an. Kill her. The Abbey Dean's voice came from the cliff, calm and firm, without any hesitation. He said this to the drunkard. The drunkard took a glance at Ning Ke, and then disappeared. Ning Ke suddenly felt a little cold, because he saw the drunkard's eyes before he left. The drunkard's eyes were cold and cruel, and the meaning was clear. I am going to kill her now. What can you do? You can only watch her being killed by me. The second sentence came from the cliff. It was from the eldest brother. Go. Take her back to Chang'an. Ning Ke looked at the eldest brother who was covered in blood, looked at the wooden stick in front of his eyebrows, and looked at the broken sword on his body, and did not know what to do. His sneak attack on the drunkard was only half successful. Next, he wanted to join hands with the eldest brother, and find a chance to survive. At least, they could make sure that Sang Sang could leave safely. The Abbey Dean only used one sentence to ruin his plan. The Abbey Dean stood at the highest point, so he could see the furthest. Now the weakest link on the cliff was not Ning Ke, but outside the cliff. The weakest one was Haoyan and she. The drunkard went to kill her. What could Ning Ke do? Stay and help the seriously injured eldest brother, or save the seriously injured Sang Sang? If he cared about one, he would lose the other. The eldest brother spoke again. He also used one sentence to ruin the Abbey Dean's plan. I won't die. The eldest brother never lied. Ning Ke believed this. And he also believed that at the end of the story, he would not cry and ask why the eldest brother lied to him in the end. Because the eldest brother really did not lie. He jumped off the cliff and ran toward Helan City. Today he left and came back and left again. Things in the world were often like this. It seemed complicated and even boring, but it had to be done. Chapter 1136. On the cliff, the trees were not swaying, and the birds were not chirping. The two of them stood facing each other. One raised his cudgel, and the other pulled out his sword. The Abbey Dean who used the sword was not necessarily more powerful than the Abbey Dean, who did not use the sword. But it meant something. His cotton-padded jacket was soaked in blood. The eldest brother knew that he could not hold on for another 7 days. So he could not ask the Abbey Dean to stay for another 7 days. But as mentioned before, Ning Ke and Sang Sang did not need 7 days to return to Chang'an. What he needed to do was to try his best. The Abbey Dean looked at the sword in his hand and said calmly, "The headmaster taught you to be kind. I thought you were different from Jun Mo, but I did not expect that you are still a disciple of the academy." The eldest brother looked at him quietly. The sword in the pot inserted in his ribs fell on the ground behind him. He said, "As a disciple of the academy, I would like to learn from you." During the short conversation, the remaining forest far away from the cliff was on fire. The blazing fire melted the snow on the mountainside, but the fire did not die down. It isolated the two of them from the world. The fire in the forest was difficult to extinguish, because the essence of the fire was the divine flame of Haoyan, the purest power. It was formed by Ning Ke's blade, and his blood when he left. Ning Ke was running toward Helan City. He jumped thousands of feet, and the rocks under his feet cracked. The iron cutlass in his hand, and the blood splashing on his body turned into sparks, and the roar of breaking air resounded through the mountains. Except for the distanceless state, no one could catch up with another distanceless state grand cultivator. If the drunkard was going to West Hill, Ning Ke would not have a chance. But since he was going to Helan City, which was more than 10 miles away, he still had a chance, because his speed had long surpassed that of the goshawk. In the blink of an eye, he ran from the cliff to the front of Helan City. He rushed into the heavily damaged city gate without hesitation. But he did not see the big black horse or the drunkard. The city gate of Helan City had been seriously deformed. Boulders rolled down from the cliffs on both sides of the city. Many parts of the arrow towers and military strongholds were smashed. Dozens of fire heads could be vaguely seen in the thick smoke. The Tang army stationed in Helan City did not want to give up. They ran around, trying to put out the fire and save the stronghold. Ning Ke shouted, "Retreat! Don't bother about it." For the Tang army in Helan City, Ning Ke had left a deep impression on them. Amidst the chaos, They confirmed his identity with just a glance. Although they did not know why Mr. 13 suddenly appeared here, they subconsciously began to obey his orders. His laughter was a little crazy, a little crazy, a little fierce in appearance, but also full of arrogant murderous intent. His emotions were so complicated that no words could describe it. A serf became a master and started to rape his master's daughter. A prince of the previous dynasty killed 36,000 of his own people to restore his country. A student pushed a nagging teacher into the pond. Yes, it was such a wonderful feeling. The humbleness and fear in the past had turned into a crazy pleasure and tyrannical desire. Thinking that it would all become real soon, his body trembled again. This time it was not because of fear, but because of excitement. The drunkard laughed out loud and even shed tears. His voice was still as unpleasant as the friction of old bronzes, as if countless copper shavings were really ground into powder and piled up in front of him like dark snow. In the crazy laughter, he drew out a sword from the flagon and suddenly stabbed at Sang Sang. Both the steps and the movements of his elbows were extremely exaggerated, as if he was dancing. Sang Sang waved her hand. A clear light fell in front of her like a water curtain and constructed her own world. The drunkard let out a strange cry. He gathered the immeasurable aura of heaven and earth and infused it into the blade. A crisp sound was heard. Sang Sang's world was broken. The drunkard's sword in the flagon broke through the clear light and stabbed into her lower abdomen. A sound was heard. The room was dead silent. The world was dead silent. Sang Sang lowered her head and looked at her lower abdomen. She looked at the sharp sword and the slowly oozing blood. She frowned slightly, as if she was a little surprised and confused. No one could break her world in the past. Even the invincible sage of sword, Lu Bai, could only stab his sword into her world. The blade turned into ashes when it was only 1 foot away from her body. But now, the drunkard's crazy sword easily broke her world. Her brows furrowed even more because of displeasure and pain. She had experienced the feeling of pain before, but it was never as real as it was now. Just like what he had experienced some time ago, the realness of life really did come from pain. The drunkard was also stunned. He had thought that she could not block his sword, but when the sword in his hand really stabbed into her body and brought out the blood, he still could not believe the scene. I defeated Hao Yin. I stabbed Hao Yin. With a loud bang, a big hole was smashed on the wall of the secret chamber. Ning Ke appeared in front of Sang Sang, holding the drunkard's sword in his right hand. He turned to look at the pale Sang Sang. His lips trembled slightly, as if he wanted to say something, but he could not. Sang Sang looked at him and said emotionlessly, "It's all your fault." Yes, she became weaker and weaker. She became more and more like a human. She could get hurt. She got hurt because he was not by her side, because he made her a human. Chapter 1. I'm so tired. It's all your fault. You're tuning in to the Li Mei's Sword of Destiny YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support. And don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.